What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was betrayed by his team, but came back with divine armor? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Why was this happening? Wasn't I good enough? Wasn't I loyal enough? Weakly, Naruto tried to raise his head high enough to look at the blood-covered pieces of metal that were poking out of his chest. Despite the fact that his own blood was coating the blades in a sickening fashion, he could make out the dried blood of those who had suffered this fate before him. Every time he saw the blood-stained metal, he tried to reach for it in a vain attempt to force the blades out, but his body wouldn't respond. He couldn't feel anything below his neck. He was pretty sure one of the blades had gone through his spine. The one plus sign to this was that he couldn't feel the pain that the three well-sharpened weapons was no doubt causing him. Sadly, instead of pain he just felt cold. Freezing cold. He really wanted to shiver or at least make some attempt at warming himself up, but he just couldn't do it no matter how much he tried. He was dying. Truthfully, he had never really thought about his own death before. Even with the threat of Akatsuki coming after him, he had been more worried about Konoha and everyone he had come to care about than himself. Thinking about those he cared about, he wondered if they were safe right now. Sakura, Kiba and Shino had broken off from the group a few miles back in order to stop one of the enemy vanguard convoys from attacking a town that was miles away from here. He wondered if they were still alright? The idea that they were suffering a fate like his own, to be stabbed in the back by the people who were meant to be allies, scared him greatly. If they had been here, maybe things would have been different? As his vision started to black out and the cold numbness started to crawl up and lay claim to the rest of his body, Naruto thought he overheard someone nearby say something about burning the bodies. He suspected he might have been hearing voices. He couldn't even hear his own heartbeat anymore. While a part of him was, well, angry that these bastards were going to get away with this, another part of him just wanted the coldness to stop. As his time on Earth drew to an end, Naruto's last thoughts drifted to someone whose appearance in his mind's eye caught him somewhat off guard. The image of a teenage girl with somewhat creamy pale skin, black hair that almost seemed blue and eyes that gave the impression of blindness flashed before his mind's eye. The image confused him a little. Not because he didn't know who it was, but more with why he was seeing her just before he died. Hinata, I'm sorry but I don't really know that much about you. I kind of wished I got to know you before now. I have a feeling I missed out on something wonderful. With deep regret, Naruto looked up at the sky with his eyes wide open as his life reached its end. Naruto Uzumaki was dead. 1 hour earlier. Northern edge of the forests of Konoha. No one knew where the plague started exactly. By the time Konoha had been called in to investigate the matter, most of the towns, villages and cities throughout northern Fire County had been infected by it. People were dying in mass. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part about all these people dying was the fact that they didn't stay dead. Many of the undead horde were little more than mindless zombies, only dangerous because they attacked in mass, swarming the living. Your average genin team was more than able to deal with such groups of creatures, clearing them out of areas being considered a low C-ranked mission. However, after the first few days, reports started coming in of different creatures within the undead horde. Things like walking skeletons and creatures that had been given the title of ghoul, for the ghoulish appearance, started to make appearances among the undead tides. The skeletons were slightly harder to kill than the normal zombies, but it was the fact that they had been confirmed wielding basic weapons such as swords, knives, spears and even bows successfully that drew attention to them. There was even a rumor of some using basic fire jutsu, but such a thing had yet to be confirmed. The ghouls, however, were slightly more worrying than the lesser undead, and it wasn't just because of their freakish looks and horrible smell. They tended to be much harder to kill, could inflict a surprising amount of damage when they managed to get a hit in, could tunnel through the earth with scary determination. They did this with neither skill nor ease, but they still managed to do it, and worst of all, they were reportedly able to think. While the heart of all their plans seemed to be nothing more advanced than swarm them. Unlike their mindless brothers and sisters in arms, they could pick out and target threats during battle. They had even been known to set up simple ambushes and guide the rest of the horde to try and aid them in battle. But it was the most recent of rumors that had caught the attention of Konoha, and thus why a 4-man team of 3 chunin and 1 genin were currently heading north. Sakura-chan, Why exactly are we checking this farm out anyway? Wouldn't our skills be better suited elsewhere? Naruto whined, annoyed that he had been called away from not only a potential bowl of free ramen, but also from being the center of positive attention. Since the outbreak had began, Naruto had proven himself to be one of Konoha's best zombie killers. His usage of shadow clones and his near-limitless energy allowed him to purge whole regions filled with zombies or stopping whole raids of the undead by himself, a fact that was starting to earn him a great deal of respect in Konoha. Sakura sighed as she answered, "Naruto, I've already gone through this with you." After examining the remains of some those who have fallen victim to this plague of undeath, it's become clear that it was manufactured by someone. After examining the contents of the stomachs of some of the older victims, we discovered traces of a plant that is rare in Fire Country. The only place it is found here is at the farm we are heading to. Combined with the fact that it is near where the outbreaks began, and this seems like the best place to start looking for whatever started this whole mess. I get that, but I want to know why it's us having to do it. Aren't there better units for this sort of thing? Before Sakura had a chance to lose her temper, Shino spoke first in his emotionless, coldly logical voice. Naruto, the reason we are doing this is because the evidence suggests that someone created this virus and might possibly be controlling the undead creatures it creates. We are here to track this man down and deal with him as we see fit. So, we're here to find and kill the big zombie boss man? There was silence for a few seconds before Shino answered, sweat dropping as he did so. That is one of putting it, yes. Sweet. If someone was willing to pay for a bowl of ramen just because one was dealing with a worthless mook, imagine what I'll get for the boss man's head. Maybe someone will pay for an all-you-can-eat meal. Sakura and Kiba almost face planted into the ground at the announcement while Shino maintained his cold logical front. Sure, Naruto had grown over the years he had been away, but some things never change. 20 minutes earlier, Kiba raised his hand into the air in a fist, stopping the team at a seemingly random branch. Sakura was the first to ask, "What is it?" "Looks like a raid of the undead bastards just went through here. A really big one too. Since it appears to have come from the direction we are going, it's a good bet that the farm's emptied out of defenders. Do we know what's to the east of here?" While only 2 members of the team were trained tracking ninja, the tracks left by the undead host were hard to miss. It had almost made a makeshift road due to the sheer number marching in it that came from the north then turned east. Looking closer, Shino stated, "It appears that a wagon may have passed through here too. Whether or not it came with the undead, I can't tell. There is a town east of here. It has a town wall, so it's better defended than your normal town, but against these sorts of numbers I doubt they would hold out for long," Sakura supplied, not liking the decision that was quickly raising up to meet them. "So, do we keep going or deal with this new threat?" Kiba asked, getting it out in the open. There was silence for a few seconds before Naruto spoke up. "You 3 stop the raiding party. I'll keep going to the farm." Kiba and Sakura were shocked by the statement while Shino appeared to think about what Naruto had suggested. "Naruto, stop being a baka. You don't honestly think we would let you go off alone? I don't care if you want to be viewed as a hero back home. Such pointless heroics are just going to get you killed." Sakura began, "Yeah, moron. Pack mates don't split up for no good reason." Kiba added, Akamaru barking his agreement. "I dislike it, but it seems to be the most logical arrangement." Shino stated, drawing the shock of Sakura and Kiba while getting Naruto's nod of approval. "What do you mean the most logical arrangement?" Sakura demanded, shock quickly turning to anger. "If the undead horde is being controlled by a central figure, then the sooner we can remove them the better. The removal of the leader would, in theory, return the undead to an uncoordinated mindless state. However, the horde would still need to be dealt with to ensure that it is no longer a threat. Out of all of us, Naruto is the best suited to face a horde on his own due to his abilities and his experience in this field of combat. While he could easily go in either direction, since we can guess the size of the force heading for the town, he would be better suited to face the unknown defenses at the farm. He would also be highly motivated to get the job done as quickly as possible since finishing his task would aid us greatly." Shino explained. After the silence that ruled the 4 of them for almost a minute, Sakura grudgingly gave her consent for the plan. "Naruto, I swear to Kami if you get yourself killed, you will bring me back to life just so you can kill me again. I'll meet up with you as soon as I'm done at the farm." Naruto finished, darting off north before another word could be said. As the rest of the team went east, Sakura feared that she would never see Naruto again. Kiba on the other hand feared that they might, but under less friendly circumstances. One of them was wiser than the other. 10 minutes earlier, standing on a tree overlooking the farm, Naruto could tell that there had been a lot of activity had happened here in the past few hours. The makeshift road from which he had split up from everyone else had led him right to the farm they were heading for. The place seemed deserted, not just in an "it's been deserted for a long time" way either. More of an "everyone left in a rush 10 minutes ago" kind of thing. However, just as he was about to leave the tree to have a closer look, something left a storage shed that was disconnected from the house. It looked like a heavily armed and armored human from a distance, but some gut feeling told him that there was more to this man than met the eye. Waiting until the man had entered the farmhouse itself, Naruto leapt from the tree he had been perched in and darted across the open ground, quietly climbing up the farmhouse wall and sliding in as silently as he could through an open window a little bit of distance away from the front door. It was only the clink of armor that gave Naruto the split-second warning to duck, saving himself from decapitation as a sword that was almost 2/3 his size flew over his head, only to have the side of his face meet the metal-covered knee that followed the sword strike. The sheer force of the impact threw Naruto across the room and thought a rotten wooden wall before sliding to a stop on the stone floor in the next barren room. Getting back to his feet, Naruto shook his head a little to clear away the dizziness before grabbing his jaw and pushing it back into place with a slight wince. Turning towards the wall he had just been put through, Naruto was surprised to see that the armored man hadn't moved at all. Despite the helmet that covered everything but a pair of unnatural glowing blue eyes, the blonde could almost physically feel the sense of amusement that the man was giving off. "So you are the blonde-haired nitwit that has been causing the fodder so much trouble? I always knew those ghouls were worthless, but to be beaten by such a poor assassin just proves how correct I was." The man's voice seemed to echo off itself, supporting the unnatural feeling surrounding the man. But there was something about the way that the man carried himself that annoyed Naruto greatly. He had seen it before back in Konoha years ago, normally from the Hyuga clan, but anyone who was richer or better connected than everyone else did it too. That sense that they believed themselves to be better than everyone else really pissed him off. "I take it you are the bastard who caused all this meaningless death to take place. Just who the hell are you so I know what name to put on your gravestone, you murdering piece of shit?" Naruto growled, his hands already twitching to go for a weapon of some kind. The armored man merely laughed at the threat, making Naruto slightly angrier at the arrogance that man was showing by not even considering him a threat. "You honestly believe that a low-born piece of trash like you could kill someone like me? Oh, that is rich. But I guess I should educate you a little before your passing. I am Baron Bloodbane, Death Knight and trusted servant of the one true king of the world. I have been sent to be the vanguard of his will here in your pathetic excuse of a land. But do not worry, foolish one, you will enjoy serving the master's bidding soon enough." Finally, too angry to stop himself anymore, Naruto grabbed the first two kunai he could get his hands on and threw them right at the self-proclaimed Baron. The twin kunai simply bounced off of Bloodbane's armor without even marking the metal. The Baron laughed at the feeble attempt at an attack, mockingly taunting the blonde-haired little bastard. "Is that the best you have to offer me, little worm? I guess I will have to show you a real attack then." Holding his large sword over his shoulder with one hand, the Baron pointed his free hand towards the blonde. Before Naruto knew what had hit him, a purple claw that seemed to be made completely of something like chakra had appeared out of nowhere and grabbed him tightly around his chest. Before he even had the chance to try and free himself, he was suddenly pulled off the ground and sent flying towards Bloodbane, who swung his sword to meet him just as he got in range. Naruto's upper and lower halves were separated by the strike. The surprise on Naruto's face lasted for a moment before both halves exploded into a cloud of white smoke. Bloodbane was caught off guard by the turn of events, even going as far as mutter, "What the?" before a loud, high-pitched screeching sound from behind him caught his attention. Turning around in time to hear a cry of "Wind Release! Rasengan!" Bloodbane barely had time to widen his eyes in horror as what could only be called a bright light with 4 sharp points slammed into his chest, sending him flying through a nearby wooden wall and into the outside world before he was engulfed in a burning bright light. Gripping his right forearm tightly at the burning sensation tearing through his right arm, Naruto couldn't help but smile at himself as he watched his attack expand and engulf the bastard who called himself a baron, or whatever the hell he claimed to be. While some might have called such a measure over the top, his memories from his clone suggested otherwise. In this case, it was better to take him down as quickly as he possibly could, and that was the only attack he could think of that had the raw power needed to pierce the man's strange but powerful armor. As his attack started to die down, Naruto started to walk carefully over to the crater that had been left behind in order to peer down at what should have been a man who was fit for a deathbed. The fact that Bloodbane was standing up scared the crap out of him, to say the least, although it was easy to see that damage had been done. All over the Baron's armor was cracked horribly and a few pieces of his chestplate was missing. His right arm dangled dead at his side and his left leg didn't seem able to support any weight on it. As the man raised his left arm and pointed it towards him, Naruto felt something grip his throat tightly, cutting the air off completely. Grabbing at his own throat in an attempt to get rid of whatever was choking him, all he found was his own skin and air. Rationally thinking that all it was just a genjutsu, Naruto seized the first kunai he got his left hand on and stabbed it into his right arm. Other than causing himself a lot of pain, he was still being choked to death by something he couldn't see or touch. Panicking now, Naruto threw the kunai at the man, hoping to break whatever attack he was using. He didn't even notice the tag wrapped around the handle until it was in the air. Flying true, the kunai stuck into the weak point at the joint that connected the Baron's armor at the left shoulder, piecing the metal and flesh. With a slight wince as acknowledgement of the damage he had suffered, Bloodbane ignored the pathetic attempt at a counterattack, only to puzzle a moment later when it felt like his shoulder was burning. Boom! As the tag went off, Bloodbane's left arm was disconnected from his body, hitting the ground at the same time that Naruto dropped to his knees. With whatever the attack had been stopped at the source, Naruto had found himself able to breathe again. Falling to his knees out of breath, the blonde quickly lost his balance and fell into the crater, rolling down while getting what little wind he had left in him knocked out of him as well as gaining a few cracked ribs. Rolling to a stop as he reached the bottom, Naruto started coughing in a fit of pain, blood and the need to get fresh air into his lungs. When the coughing subsided after a few moments, Naruto laid there for just a few seconds. It was when he heard the scraping of metal across stone that he forced himself to sit back up, eyes widening in horror at the sight coming towards him. The Baron was not only back on his feet, but very slowly dragging himself over to where Naruto lay. The man's left arm was missing completely and laying somewhere on the ground behind him while his seemingly dead right arm was dragging the massive weapon along the ground. Despite the nightmarish amount of pain he must have no doubt been in, all Naruto saw was pure engaged murder in the man's eyes. You will pay for this indignity against me. I will make you suffer an eternity of torment and it will still not be enough. I will hunt down everyone you've ever loved or cared about and make you watch as they twist and scream in pain for your crimes, you low-born piece of fucking filth. Despite the injuries that seemed to cripple his form, the man still raised his weapon with a frightening amount of speed. Diving to the side to avoid the strike, Naruto's eyes bulged in shock as a large fissure opened up in the ground starting from where the blow began. Not getting time to think about capitalizing, the freakishly large sword almost broke the sound barrier as the weapon was pulled from the ground in an upward slash. The blonde was barely able to jump backwards fast enough to dodge the bulk of the strike, but he didn't get away completely unharmed. There was a long, thankfully shallow cut starting just above his right hip and ending level to his left elbow. Wincing slightly to the pain, Naruto was forced to duck as the blade came around for a third strike, this time trying to take his head off at the neck. Almost sensing the weak spot that had been exposed due to Bloodbane extending his attack too far, Naruto leased out a kick towards the side of man's right knee with all the force he could muster. Connecting with bone-shattering force, Naruto felt the bone give way to his attack. With the bones in his right knee broken and unable to support any weight on his left one, Bloodbane's legs gave out underneath him, causing the leader of the undead in Fire County to fall onto his back heavily, screaming and swearing vengeance at the low-born scum all the way. Clearly breathless, injured and in pain, Naruto was almost willing to wait a few moments before planning his next course of action before an idea suddenly entered his head. Almost in a trace-like state, Naruto reached into his kunai holder one last time and grabbed hold of his very last one. Also seizing hold of his final explosive paper tag, it was just a small matter of work to wrap the tag around the blade tightly. Standing up, Naruto forced himself to walk towards the still screaming Baron, who was trying to claw his way over to the sword he had dropped when he had fallen by his almost completely dead remaining arm. Stopping by the man's head, Naruto almost felt like he was watching himself act as he jammed his weapon into the man's left eye, causing him to scream in pain loudly. These screams only got worse as the tag caught fire inside of his skull. Making the attempt to jump back, Naruto's injuries clearly prevented him from getting far enough away to escape injury. Boom! Yet, somehow he did? Landing on his feet with only the slightly wince of pain coursing through his body, Naruto looked back at what should have been nothing more than smoking wreckage and charred bone only to stare as it appeared that the man's head was still somehow there. Looking at it closer however, Naruto noticed the plume of smoke that was coming out of the cracks and gaps in the helmet. Taking a few steps closer, he could smell the burned human remains that had once been the Baron's head. The helmet itself had not only survived but had completely contained the blast, trapping it on the inside. What the hell is that stuff made from? Looking at the now definitely deceased body of Baron Bloodbane, which was a rather stupid name now that he thought of it, Naruto was about to start thinking about heading off and meeting up with the rest of his team when he suddenly felt cold. Finding himself unable to move his body below his neck, Naruto looked down and spotted 3 rather sharp-looking pieces of blood-covered metal sticking out of his chest in different areas. Already finding it impossible to move or breathe, Naruto couldn't stop himself from falling onto his back when a slight breeze that made its way into the crater pushed him backwards. It was only then, as he laid there at the bottom of a crater he had created laying next to a man that he had killed, did Naruto see the 2 men at the top of the crater. 2 men wearing the headbands of Konoha. In the end, nothing mattered but the continued domination of Konoha over the rest of the shinobi world. It was the creed that all those who served Root lived and died by. They were the most loyal and most obedient of all servants of Konoha, as all tools should be. They neither questioned nor discarded their orders, succumbed to their emotions or even thought of betraying their village. They had sacrificed everything they owned, their own emotions and even their names in order to serve their homeland, as all loyal tools should. But today was special. Today was the day that would mark Konoha's rebirth as a world power. Naruto Uzumaki, genin of Konoha, student of the Toad Sage, unofficial son of the 4th Hokage and container of the 9-tailed demon fox. By all accounts he was almost as loyal to Konoha as any member of Root was, a rare feat for a non-member. But in the end he was still a tool of Konoha and Lord Danzo had wisely judged that he would be able to serve his village better dead than alive. While it was standard for Root members to rid themselves of such silly things as want or regret, both men still felt a small but weird sense of longing to inform the now dead Jinchuriki that he hadn't just been discarded just like any tool that had outlived its usefulness. That his death would be what forced Konoha to become more militant, to rally those who would normally object to such a thing to the cause. That Konoha would truly become great once more without the pathetic teachings of the Third weakening it anymore. They didn't though, for they were trained better than that. Silently jumping into the crater, they went about doing their secondary objective, recovery. While they wouldn't be able to take the bodies of either Naruto or this so-called Baron back to Konoha in order to ensure that they were found by more legally acknowledged sources, they would be more than able to salvage certain items of interest. Namely, some pieces of the Baron's armor and his weapon. Having witnesses the attacks that the armor had gone through, the fact that it was still mostly intact was surprising to say the least, while the weapon hadn't even suffered any damage despite undergoing the same treatment. One of the 2 went to pick up the sword while the other went to work on removing the dead man's helmet. Just as the helmet man placed his hands on the bottom of the piece of armor, planning to remove it with ease, the suddenly clanging of metal on the ground caught his attention. Turning his head towards his partner, he was almost surprised to find a block of ice completely encasing his fellow Root member completely, the sword having slipped from its grasp when the ice that made up the block had overtaken the nameless man's hands. Suddenly turning towards the top of the crater with a kunai in his hand, the last thing he saw was a creature that seemed to be made of bone dressed in a rich-looking purple robe of unknown design as a ball of blue entered his chest, freezing his heart and the blood running to and from it in his veins, killing him instantly. Back in his days amongst the living, Amalthazad had always known that life sometimes gave you lemons. The fact that all life seemed to have for him was lemons had been what had lamentably driven him to the arts of necromancy and the Scourge in the first place. Sadly, even undeath had its hidden little pains in the ass, and the one that bothered him the most was one Baron Bloodbane, loyal servant of the Lich King and all-around jackass. When the new land had been discovered, the king had wisely decided to send in a small scouting force in order to get an idea of what was waiting for them there, as well as enough plague in order to raise an army if need be. Out of all the Liches that had tried to get their metaphorical foot in the door with this opportunity, Amalthazad was thrilled when he was selected for the task of gathering information. Much to his misfortune, Bloodbane was selected to be in charge of security. This was a problem because, once they had arrived and set themselves up in an abandoned farm in the middle of nowhere, it became apparent that Bloodbane's idea of defense was to take the offensive. Stealing the samples of the plague they had brought with them without telling him, Bloodbane unleashed it on a number of towns and villages, mostly raising zombies, skeletons and a couple of hundred or so ghouls. To make things worse, the man couldn't lead the army he had created out of a wet paper bag. He was as incompetent as he was arrogant, and for a Death Knight or anyone who served the king of the Frozen Throne, incompetence was a crime that wasn't forgiven. Thankfully for himself, Amalthazad had made sure that he would not share the Death Knight's fate when their master discovered his many blunders. It had taken much effort, but the Lich had been able to recruit a dozen or so members of the local population to the cult of the damned, giving him at least a small spy network to use. And what information he received! Within the first few days he had learned so much of these elemental nations, and he knew he had only touched the surface. But his most important discovery was the reason why Bloodbane's stupid attempts at taking the land through force had failed: the shinobi. They were better fighters than most warriors, capable of feats of stealth greater than any mere rogue, could heal injuries and illnesses as well if not better than a priest, could twist creation and the elements like a shaman or mage, and according to some rumors some of them could summon and control powerful demons better than any warlock could dream of. Most amazing of all was the fact that any single one of them could do all of this. And those were only fringe benefits for joining the club. He had tried to get some test subjects or the remains of shinobi in order to discover just why they could do all these things, but once again Bloodbane failed to deliver. Oh sure, he was able to give him a corpse every once in a while, but they were normally the low-ranked acolytes called genin, and thanks to Bloodbane and his horde there normally wasn't enough left intact to discover anything at all. But things had suddenly turned for the better. Suddenly, he had 3 nearly perfectly intact bodies of shinobi that were clearly higher-grade stuff than mere genin, and one of them had even killed Bloodbane. It was a joyous day. If he had still have legs he might have danced, he was so happy. But he didn't, and he had an audience of ghouls and the few cult of the damned members he had been able to enlighten. He might just do a twirl later, when no one was looking. "Lord Amalthazad, what do you wish us to do with the bodies of the shinobi and former Baron Bloodbane?" the current head of his little branch of the cult asked respectfully, as was proper. "Gather the remains of the shinobi and the fool together. We will be taking them back to Northrend with us. Afterwards, destroy all evidence that we were even here to begin with." Why are we taking back the remains of Bloodbane? Hasn't his constant failures earned him the punishment of final death? The fool's parts might still be useful for the Lich King's designs, even if only to return Bloodbane from the grave long enough so he might have the pleasure of putting the fool there himself. Besides, his armor is far too useful to simply throw away. Another Death Knight will need armaments after all. Of course, Lord Amalthazad, but are you sure you wish to go to the effort of repairing such a damaged suit of armor? At this point it might be easier to just melt it down and forge a whole new set. What are you talking about? The armor shouldn't be. Making a closer examination of the fallen Bloodbane's armor, Amalthazad was honestly surprised by the fact that it had been damaged at all, let alone so badly. Each piece seemed to have dozens of large cracks running through it, while chunks of the metal in the right arm, left leg and chest plate were completely missing, adding even more cracks in what remained. That is interesting. Interesting didn't even cover half of what the Lich was feeling right now. It was no secret that Bloodbane's armor had been made almost completely from serenite, a dark and twisted metal that was infamous for being next to impossible to damage, let alone destroy. When he had seen the fool's dead body, he had assumed, quite correctly, that the blonde had taken advantage of the gaps in the armor where the metal didn't cover, like the connection between the joints or the eye holes to land the death blow. He had ensured that this happened when he suggested to the blonde that the best course of action was to finish the Death Knight off. He was that worn from the battle he didn't notice that the idea wasn't his own. But to be able to damage Serenite armor like this, it was unheard of. Many had tried to do such a thing before, but this was the first time he had ever seen or heard of anyone succeeding. The Lich turned his attention back to the blonde-haired boy who had not only been a thorn in the side of Bloodbane's plans, but had also ended the arrogant fool's life. The boy was powerful, that was certain. Not as powerful as the fool had been though. Despite his flaws when it came down to leading others into battle, Bloodbane was a rather high-ranked member of the Scourge for a reason. If he had taken his battle with the blonde seriously from the start, the boy would not have lasted long against the onslaught that the Death Knight could have unleashed for long. But the dice had already been cast, and there was much potential here. Your orders, Lord Amalthazad? Gather the remains of the fallen and prepare them for the trip through the portal to Icecrown. The two unknown shinobi are to be handed over to the Research and Development Department. Bloodbane and the blonde are to be presented to the Lich King himself. Take extra care of both of them. Anyone who fails in such a simple task will feel the full extent of my wrath. Once we are ready to leave, all remaining evidence we were even here is to be destroyed. Understood? Yes, Lord Amalthazad, we will get on it right away. With a low bow, the leader of the cultists started to shout orders to the other cultists, getting the mob running about to perform the tasks given of them. Amalthazad simply continued to examine the remains of the blonde shinobi who had freed him from the fool of a Death Knight he had been forced to listen to. While his cultists heard his voice when he spoke, he was speaking only to himself, his powers over the arcane and his experience with the dark arts of necromancy giving him a rare gift of foresight. From this defeat will come many victories. 3 hours later, when Sakura, Shino, Kiba and Orochimaru arrived at the farm that had been their target from the beginning, they were scared of what they might find. Naruto had promised to join up with them once he was finished here and he never came. Either he had broken his promise or something had gone really wrong. When all they found at the farm was burning rubble and a large crater in the ground, they all somehow knew it was the latter. There was no body. Not Naruto's, not a zombie's, it was just empty. Kiba, can you smell Naruto anywhere? Sakura was clearly trying to keep the fear out of her voice, but she was quickly failing in her task. Kiba sniffed the air and sighed in a defeated manner. There's nothing here. It's as if someone completely purged all the possible scents that were here. All I can smell is us, smoke and ash. Shino, please tell me that you planted one of your bugs on him. Sakura demanded, but the underling pleading tone in her voice was easy to hear. Shino was silent for a few seconds as he listened to his hive before pushing his glasses up, his eyebrows pointed downwards. The hive buzzed loudly for a few seconds before returning to a barely heard buzz. While I planted a female on Naruto, I am afraid that none of my males are able to pick up her scent. This could either mean that she is dead or something happened to prevent them from smelling her. If it is the latter, I will admit that I have never heard of something strong enough to block out the scent of a female Kikaichu before. Sakura was clearly starting to freak out at the news. Naruto was missing and suddenly there is no way to track him down. This happened far too professionally to have been the undead rotting bodies they had been killing for the last week or so. Trying to calm Sakura down, it was surprisingly Kiba who said, "Look, I know it looks bad. But maybe if go a little distance away from the farm and sniff around we might be able to catch his scent? Maybe the guys who did this forgot to cover their tracks completely." It was a pathetic hope, but it was all they currently had. It did calm Sakura down a little though. What are we waiting for? Naruto needs our help. They searched for a solid 4 hours, trying to catch a single whiff of either Naruto of Shino's missing female Kikaichu over a solid 4 miles away from the farm. All they found was the overpowering smell of rotten flesh. In silence, they turned back to Konoha defeated. They didn't say a word to each other on the way back, but the silence was broken every now and then by a sob from Sakura. Naruto was gone. The first birth celebrates life. The second birth mocks it. But what exactly is being mocked? Life begins and as time passes the baby becomes an infant. The infant becomes a child. The child becomes an adult. The adult becomes an elder and then life comes to an end. It is a cycle of growth and decay that ends when the rate of decay is faster than the rate of growth. Once life ends, the being that has just died ceases to be. Sure, many claim that the righteous pass into heaven and the wicked burn in hell, but who exactly is passing the judgments and by what standards are just and wicked held to? If a man stole from a greedy rich noble and gave the money he stole to those who truly needed it, would he be considered wicked for theft for stealing the ill-gotten gains of a tyrant? If a soldier was to drag a poor, defenseless man out of his home and away from his family, hurting him in the process before throwing him in a rat-infested prison cell to rot for an unknown number of months, maybe even years, just because that poor man couldn't avoid to pay an overpriced tax, would that make the soldier just for performing his duty to his corrupt lord? Instead of risking your soul, your very being to the unknown, there is another option. The second birth, to raise from the grave as an immortal, to break free of the cycle of life and death altogether. Why risk your soul to the judgment of an unknown, often fickle God when you can ensure that it will be safe forever while remaining on this plane of existence forever as an immortal? Death comes for everyone, but it need not be the end. First page of the Cult of the Damned recruitment booklet. Unknown location. Naruto gasped in a lungful of air, the shock running through his system clear to see to anyone who witnessed the act as he sat up, his eyes as wide open as his mouth as he looked around in a blind panic. He felt weird. It was as if he wanted to throw up, cough up his lungs, tear out and eat someone's heart and praise the world around him for considering him fortunate enough to be granted this second chance. As images started to bombard his mind without context, Naruto quickly recognized the last thing he had seen. Looking down at his chest, the metal blades that had been there, had ended his life, were long gone. He did notice a few new changes though. His skin was a lot paler than he last remembered it being, and the glowing blue runes that appeared tattooed on his chest, arms and legs were rather new too. He was also missing a shirt, pants, he was completely naked. Alright, what do you remember? I think my name was Naruto. Yeah, that sounds right. I think I died. But wait, if I'm dead, where am I? Looking away from his own body in order to get a better understanding of where he currently was, the newly awakened Naruto felt his eyes widen at the sight around him. He appeared to be in the middle of some sort of large arena. At first glance there wasn't any exit, so the blonde turned his attention to the arena floor itself. He was surrounded on all sides by piles of snow, the bones and meat of what he could only guess were things that had been in the arena before him and didn't win their battles, and discarded weapons of all shapes and sizes. Looking up at the sky, all he could see was the blackest of storm clouds, blocking all light from either the moon or the sun. Looking around the arena once more, Naruto took notice of the snow again. Giving the ground a stomp without even looking at it, it was easy to tell that it was dirt that had been frozen so hard that it was like one of the harder rocks. Hang on, it looks like I've been here for a while, completely naked and exposed to the elements. Taking into account the snow and the extent that the ground is frozen, and it should be more than cold enough for me to have frozen to death long ago. Or at least be freezing cold. Then why aren't I? Instead of suffering from the freezing, hellish cold that was tearing into everything else, Naruto felt comfortable. Not warm by any means, but not cold either. It was quite pleasant. After the freezing cold that had taken him in his final moments, this wasn't half bad. Before he could think on the matter any further, something exploded out of the ground 10 feet to his left. As the snow and dust settled around it, Naruto saw the rotting flesh of the humanoid arm as it stuck its bone claws into the rock, dragging the rest of its ghoulish form out of the rock-hard ground with it. A memory flashed through Naruto's mind at the sight of the creature, showing many more of these ghouls trying to attack him, to kill him, but he killed them instead. Killed them by the hundreds some battles. Around him, more rotting fists burst from the ground, clear signs that reinforcements were coming to back up the ghoul that had already crawled out of its grave. Kill them all. Naruto did not know where the voice in his head came from, who or what it belonged to, and honestly, he didn't care. He reacted to the order without even questioning it, reaching down and grabbing hold of the nearest weapon he could find, a worn-looking short-bladed katana. Leaping towards the unprepared undead ghoul like only a shinobi could, Naruto gave a loud yell as a war cry before bringing the sword down and slicing the creature in half, one of its legs still buried in the ground before turning to the next nearest target. He didn't notice that his voice was deeper and had an echo-like element to it, or that his eyes glowed an unnatural blue. All he knew was that for the first time that he could remember, which wasn't a whole lot at the moment, Naruto truly felt alive. Konoha, the funeral service of Naruto Uzumaki. He should never have gone off alone. I should demote Sakura and the other two morons for letting him go without invoking violence to make him stay with the team. It had been 2 days after Naruto had vanished on a mission, and a great many search teams being sent out to try and find some trace of him, when a frog messenger arrived from the self-proclaimed super pervert himself. After getting word that his student had vanished completely without a trace, the first thing that Jiraiya had done was check the summoning scroll he often carried around on his person at all times. Naruto's name had been crossed out in blood, a sign that he was dead. It hadn't made any sense to Tsunade when she had first read the message then, and even now, as she stood silently looking at the picture of the smiling blonde that was placed on an empty wooden box, she still didn't fully understand what had happened. She was still numb from the shock that the blonde baka was gone. When Naruto's death and funeral had been announced, much of Konoha had been saddened by the loss of happiness and energy that the blonde had brought to Konoha. There were some die-hard bigots, however, that had dared to be pleased by the news of the genin's demise. Few made their happiness known publicly, however. Those that did suddenly found their lives in Konoha very difficult indeed. I think he would have been happy that so many people turned up from his funeral. Most of Konoha had shown for the service, far more than the Hokage had expected. She had almost been worried that she was going to have to make a second, mandatory service just to make sure that Konoha would give one of its best and brightest the send-off that they deserved. But many had come. Almost everyone whose lives Naruto had touched positively over the years had come to Konoha to attend the service. Those that couldn't be there in person for whatever reason had gone to great lengths, and in some cases, expense, to ensure that flowers were placed on their behalf at the service. That had been some time ago. Slowly the crowd had broken up in order to return to their everyday lives. Quickly all that remained were the remaining members of the Rookie 12, minus Sasuke and Naruto now, their senseis and their teacher from the academy, Iruka and Jiraiya. As time passed, though, one by one they left, till only 4 had remained. Minutes ago, that number had become 3 when Sakura had silently walked away with her head down, her eyes red from crying. Tsunade sadly looked over her at former teammate and nodded to him before turning her attention to the only other person who had stayed. "Hinata, it's time to go. Just a little longer, please." Tsunade sighed sadly. While the girl was still better off confidence-wise than she had been when she was younger, she hadn't started stuttering again yet. The girl was clearly broken over her crush's death. "Hinata, he would honestly hate to see you suffer like this because of his sake. You know this more than anyone." The teenage heiress nodded stiffly, unable to shed any more tears than she already had. "Are you sure he is dead? Not just missing?" It was Jiraiya's turn to sigh sadly, getting the younger woman's attention. When someone who signs a contract dies, their name automatically gets a line crossed through it. It's an old secret of the many different contact summons that they used to prevent a past summoner from being brought back to life as some undead servant for the purpose of summoning their chosen animals. Quote, oddly silent for a few seconds, Hinata took a deep breath before asking, "Is there any way that we could bring him back if we found him?" Both Sannin exchanged looks with each other very quickly at the question. This sort of question was almost expected of everyone who had ever lost a loved one. It was always a tempting thought, bringing back those who had passed on. But it was a very dark path, and there was a reason jutsus that performed such an unholy act were forbidden. Better to stop this now, before the idea gained too much momentum. However, I do agree with you when you say we need to find him. I want to give Konoha his favorite son the burial that he deserves. I don't mind saying it, but just knowing what happened to him would make things, not easier, but at least we would have closer. And someone to take our collective angers out on. Hinata, will you help me find Naruto and get some answers about what happened? Tsunade asked, maintaining a professional appearance but not hiding the determination in her voice while keeping an eye on the Hyuga. Hinata was silent for a long time, staring at the ever-smiling picture of the blonde boy she had never had the nerve to tell how much she loved him. Now it was too late, but maybe she could at least perform this one final task for her late love. "Yes, Lady Hokage. I would be honored to help you find Naruto-kun." Unknown location in Ice Crown. Big Ball Rasengan. Both Naruto and his clone shouted in a deep, echo-affected voice in unison as they slammed said attack into the guts of a creature twice his size that looked like it had been stitched together rather poorly from the remains of several different corpses, given a large chain with a rusty hook and a meat cleaver to use as weapons, and smelled like the corpses it was made from were left out to rot in the sun before being used to create this abomination. Said monstrosity was sent flying in the air as the larger, and more powerful, version of the Rasengan collided with its guts. The look of surprise on the large but slow brute's face at the fact it had just been made airborne vanished as it smacked into the arena wall and exploded in a shower of black blood, rotten flesh and muscle, bone and what could only be called bile. As the makeshift shower rained down on the arena and to an extent Naruto, said white-haired blonde wiped some of the grim away from his eyes by scooping up a handful of clean snow and using it as a makeshift towel before admiring the level of carnage he had wrought in the arena while he took the time to catch his breath. What had once been an empty patch of frozen earth and snow was carpeted by broken bodies, blood and stuff that didn't really have a name but smelled awful nonetheless. Naruto himself looked like he had gone swimming in a pool of the bodily fluids that had almost completely coated the floor of the arena. The only places not covered were currently his eyes and the hand he had picked up the snow in, since using his bare hands would have only made the mess worse. He had lost track of just how long he had been fighting since there was no real way of telling time here since day and night looked the same because of the everlasting cloud cover above him. He had long ago lost track of how many ghouls he had slain here. He didn't really care either. He had slain at least a couple dozen or so spider-like creatures that had burst out of the ground with the ghouls however, and the destruction of the poorly made fat tub of lard and bile marked the third of such creatures he had put down. Clearly expecting more company to arrive at any given time, Naruto looked down at the arena floor again before swiftly shifting the broken and bleeding remains of a dead ghoul off of a weapon handle, finding a decent-looking war axe underneath. As much as he had liked the katana, it had broken after what felt like the 18th ghoul, forcing him to replace it with a new sword. When that one broke, the cycle repeated quite a few times. Checking out the weight and balance of the axe in his hands, Naruto nodded as he felt confident that it would last a couple of waves before breaking like the rest of them. At one stage he had questioned the fact that he knew how to use the weapons he was wielding, since none of the images in his head showed him ever using any of them. He had then proceeded to behead a ghoul with a well-aimed spear strike and simply pushed the thought out of his head. He was simply enjoying himself too much using the weapons to care about such a minor details as how just yet. With a great deal of noise, a large portion of what he had believed to be an arena wall started to open up like a large gate. Turning towards it, Naruto got ready for whatever was to come for him now. Things hadn't worked out exactly as planned. Hidden safely in one of his many root safe houses in Konoha, Danzo silently contemplated the turn of recent events. The plan had been quite simple really. Taking advantage of the undead monsters roaming the land, his root agents were meant to find and kill the Kyuubi container Naruto Uzumaki and mutilate his remains so that it looked like the undead had killed him. His violent death would cripple Tsunade's ability to lead, meaning a new and stronger leader would have to take her place. Once he had taken the seat of Hokage, he would then use Naruto's death to convince those he had befriended and allied with in life to rally under the new, more militant administration. However, that plan was halted when the teenager's earthly remains were never located and were completely gone without a trace, along with his two agents in the field. While his death was officially announced after it was discovered that the boy's name had been crossed off the frog summons contract when he had died, it didn't have the reaction that seeing his desecrated corpse would have. Tsunade hadn't broken down from the pain of his loss, instead growing stronger from the pain and starting to implement more policies in order to better train Konoha's shinobi for years to come. He would admit that despite it not going to plan, it had still been a victory for Konoha as a whole, which made it a victory in his eyes. Still, there were too many loose ends that needed to be followed up. Too many unanswered questions. Report. A member of his root organization appeared out of the shadows of the room, kneeling before his master. Despite numerous attempts and using all the techniques at our disposal, we were unable to find any sign of the Kyuubi container or our agents in the field. Despite the background interference of the undead, we were able to confirm half a dozen or so unknown persons walking towards the farm at about the same time as the disappearance. However, they do not leave the farm. We also discovered the small patches of ground at the farm appeared to have been frozen or covered in ice at around the estimated time of the vanishes. We have yet to figure out what caused it or why it happened, but for now we are unable to connect it directly to the happenings at the farm. The report given, Danzo nodded with an emotionless blank face. Carry on the search for now and try to find some more leads. Yes, Lord Danzo, was all the grunt said, vanishing back into the shadows. Danzo didn't show it, but he was worried. Far too many unanswered questions. It wasn't the armor or the weapon that one first noticed about the man who was causally entering the arena, stepping over or stomping on any corpse that got in his way. It was the sheer level of power that he gave off that had Naruto's complete attention. The blonde may not have been a sensor in life, but this wasn't so much sensed as forcing itself to be acknowledged. You didn't just feel the power coming off of the man, you could taste it. What made it even more terrifying was the fact that he wasn't even trying to show off his power. That what you were feeling was natural for him. Once you got over the sheer, mind-breaking power that was coming off the man, the eye was drawn to the sword he wielded. It was big, made in a design that Naruto had never witnessed before. As he stared at it, he felt like it was trying to pull him towards it, trying to consume him in order to quench a never-ending hunger. Jerking his head away from the blade, Naruto returned his gaze to the man himself, only to hear the voice in his mind that had given him orders before whispered to him once more. Attack him with everything you have. Without another thought, Naruto readied the axe he had picked up and leapt towards the armored man, the war growl coming from his mouth belonging more to an animal than a human as he brought the axe down in an overhead strike. With little effort, the armored man brought his blade up, intercepting the surprisingly fast blonde's weapon and shattering the axe before backhanding Naruto with his free hand, sending him flying across the arena with as much ease as swatting a fly. Hitting the ground hard and rolling over rock-hard icy dirt, discarded weapons and broken bodies, Naruto slammed against the arena wall with bone-cracking force. Grunting loudly through the pain in order to stop himself from screaming in agony, he forced himself back to his feet once more. An image of a scene like the one he had just gone through flashed through his mind, only this time it was a young, beautiful blonde woman in her 20s that was striking him. Much like then, he could tell that the armored man was holding back. If he had wanted to, he could have killed him with that backhand strike alone. So I'm being tested then, very well then. Placing his hands in a hand seal that he remembered doing so often that it had burned the memory into his body, Naruto called out, Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, consuming his half of the arena in smoke. When the smoke began to clear, there were over 50 copies of the blonde standing around at different sections of the arena, most having picked up one of the many weapons laying on the ground. One of the Narutos nearest to the armored man yells, "Charge!" which all the other Narutos follow as the attack begins anew. The armored man didn't show any sign of fear of the impending assault, raising his free gauntlet-wearing hand and pointing it towards the charging mob. Projectiles of green energy started to fly out of the hand in the dozens, each one taking the shapes of skulls mid-flight. Despite the attempts of the clones to close the distance or dodge the attacks, each skull blast found its mark, blowing the clone hit up in a puff of white smoke. After a while, when the half of the arena that the Narutos had started their attack from was completely blocked out by white smoke, the armored man lowered his gauntlet, waiting for the next move to be made. He did not have to wait long. Big Ball Rasengan. Two Narutos seemed to appear out of nowhere from the man's left, charging towards him with the bright glowing ball of raw power lighting up the arena as they charged at him. Turning towards them, the man raised his hand once again. The air around the man seemed to ripple as it grew darker and colder around the gauntlet before he mentally pushed the attack forwards. Unable to dodge the attack, both Narutos were hit by what could have only been called a pure Arctic wind. Within seconds, both versions of Naruto were flash frozen into pure ice sculptures of themselves. With the sudden loss of stability, the larger-than-normal Rasengan that was being maintained by both of them exploded, sending shards of ice flying in all directions as the sculptures were destroyed violently. It was only after the explosion had died down that the man heard the screeching wailing coming from behind him. Wind release. Rasengan. Turning around with a speed that simply should not have been possible for a man wearing that much armor, Naruto was surprised when all the man did in preparation for the attack was stick his sword into the ground and raise his free hand to cover the gaps in his helmet that allowed him to see the outside world. Jumping back as the attack stuck the armored man, Naruto quickly made as much distance as possible while ignoring the burning pain in his arm. The elemental-powered Rasengan stuck the man's chest plate with all of its fury. However, instead of sending the man flying back, all it managed to do was push him along the ground a few meters, causing the rock-hard dirt to be torn up as the man's feet dug into it. It then exploded outwards, consuming the man in a bright flash of light. Losing sight of the man in the brightness, Naruto kept his senses open in case of a sneak attack while he started to rub his right arm. He could still feel the man's power, and it wouldn't be too hard to have substituted himself to avoid the attack. As the bright light caused by his attack faded, Naruto still looked around the arena, trying to find where the man was hiding when a deep, echo-like chuckle brought his attention back to where his attack had exploded. Standing in the center of a shallow crater on a piece of ground that had been shielded by his bulk, the armored man still stood, the gauntlet-wearing hand he had used to shield his face lowering as the man chuckled. To Naruto's absolute horror, the man was unharmed. His armor wasn't even scratched. That was my strongest attack, and it did nothing. Who is this guy? I can see how you could have bested a champion like Bloodbane in a one-on-one battle, Naruto. I am honestly impressed. The man stated with a deep, echoing voice that Naruto recognized instantly. You are the one who was whispering in my mind, weren't you? Another amused chuckle sounded from the armored-wearing man as he took a few steps forwards and dropped into the shallow crater, walking the few measly steps to his weapon that was still sticking out of the ground at the edge of the hole in the ground, unharmed. While it sounded like the sort of chuckle that was used by arrogant fools who believed themselves better than everyone else, Naruto could tell the difference between the two. An arrogant fool holds the belief that they are better than everyone else, regardless of whatever evidence comes their way that they weren't. This guy was better than everyone else. Belief had nothing to do with it, and the evidence supported the claim. Kneel to your king. Without a single word or thought of protest, Naruto fell to his knees with his head facing the blood-covered icy ground. He kept his eyes locked there as he heard the suddenly thunderous footsteps of the godlike man approach him. Naruto Uzumaki, in life you bested the Death Knight Baron Bloodbane, only to be betrayed and cut down by those who claimed to be your allies in your moment of triumph. As reward for your achievement in life, I granted you the opportunity to earn the position that you had opened up by slaying Bloodbane, which you have succeeded in accomplishing. From this moment onwards, you will be one of my most feared instruments of destruction, a favored tool to be used against my enemies, a champion of the Scourge. Raise, my chosen knight, and embrace immortality. Images ran through Naruto's mind of his last few moments of amongst the living, of the two men wearing headbands with a leaf printed on it. The symbol of the shinobi of his former home in Konoha. He remembered serving his home, ready to give his life for it if needed, and in the end it had betrayed him. Raising to his feet, Naruto kept his head bowed as he announced, "Thank you for giving me this chance to redeem myself, Your Majesty." The Lich King chuckled once more, a small grin forming on his features, pleased with his latest champion. "Before I give you your first task, there is something you must witness." As his last word faded into memory, the gate as which he had entered opened again, this time letting out a creature that Naruto had never seen before. It looked like a huge skeleton that was floating on an icy mist, wearing an expensive-looking purple robe. In life, it would have scared the ever-loving crap out of Naruto, but now, he couldn't help but respect the creature. As the skeleton approached, Naruto could feel the power coming off of him. It was nowhere near as powerful as his new lord and master, but it was never to sneeze at either. As the Lich dropped the body it was carrying at the feet of its master, he bowed deeply. "You summoned me, my king?" Looking from the Lich to the body it had brought, Naruto's eyes widened a little. It was naked as he was without his armor, and they had replaced his head with a new one. You could see the stitch work around the neck, but there was no mistaking that missing arm and broken knee anywhere. "Amalthazad, you were tasked with gathering information on the now-named elemental nations, and if possible creating not only a new branch of the cult of the damned there, but setting up a foothold there for future Scourge activities. While the mission was for the most part a failure, I have judged that it wasn't you who caused it." Once more, the Lich Amalthazad bowed deeply to the Lord and Master of the Scourge. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Seemingly ignoring the Lich's thanks as he turned his attention to the remains of Baron Bloodbane, the Lich King lifted Frostmourne and pointed it towards the mostly broken carcass. A purple bolt of energy shot out of the blade like a lightning bolt, striking the body and giving it new life as Orboz suddenly shot up, gasping for air. Looking around, Bloodbane's eyes landed on Naruto. Anger quickly overcame the Baron. "Why, you low-born piece of fill? Orboz Bloodbane, you will show respect to your master before you pursue petty grudges in my presence." The king interrupted, cutting Orboz off completely. Naruto watched the already pale face of Orboz lose color as he suffered what could only be called the greatest, "oh shit" moment he had ever witnessed. As Orboz quickly worked himself into a kneeling position, their master quickly walked over to him. "Master, please forgive me for..." Before Bloodbane could get any further, the Lich King's free hand was gripping his throat, cutting off his words physically. With yet another show of strength, Bloodbane was lifted a good 2 feet into the air by his throat. "You were tasked with protecting Amalthazad while her gathered information on the new lands and their defenses, and instead of performing the task I gave you, you stole samples of my plague so you could run off and play warlord. Master, I can. And then you went and messed that up by leading those mortals you're granted undeath so poorly that they wouldn't have been able to fight their way out of a wet paper bag under your command. Your Majesty, and to add insult to injury, you then proceeded to get yourself killed because you disregarded your enemy because they didn't have a noble birth. Sire, please forgive em." The words died in Orbaz's mouth as his master swung his blade upwards, hacking off his only remaining arm before dropping him onto the cold ground. "You've failed me in all of these ways due to your own incompetence, and you have the nerve to beg for my forgiveness?" Raising his foot into the air, Naruto watched as his new king brought his armored foot down on Bloodbane's only remaining good knee with a sickening crunch. Naruto even winced at the man he had spent his last moments alive killing, screamed in pain. "I do not tolerate failure or incompetence, Bloodbane. You of all people should know this." The ground around the former Baron exploded upwards and the rotting hands of half a dozen ghouls reached for the sky before returning to the earth to dig the rest of themselves out. Naruto wasn't quite sure what was happening, but when he heard his master's voice more in his head, he obeyed it without question. Watch and learn the price of incompetence, Death Knight. Once the ghouls were completely free of the icy ground, the god of the Scourge turned away from Bloodbane before announcing, "Dispose of this incompetent fool." Without waiting for another word, the ghouls pounced on the downed Bloodbane, sinking their rotting teeth into his flesh. "Wah, what are you doing? Let me go, you little..." "Stop, stop, stop crewing my leg, stop." Naruto wanted to look away. He wanted to close his eyes, cover his ears and just pretend that he couldn't hear the screams of the man as he was being torn apart and eaten alive. But he couldn't. His master had ordered him to watch, and by hell he was going to do it. It taught him a very important lesson. Never fail the king, ever. When the screams finally started to fade and Bloodbane returned to the grave, while the ghouls continued with their task joyously, the king started to walk towards the gate he had entered the arena by, seemingly ignoring Naruto, Amalthazad and the execution he had just ordered. "Amalthazad, you are now in charge of Death Knight Naruto Uzumaki until further notice. Do what you feel you need to do, but ensure he doesn't disappoint me," said Lich quickly bowed, giving Naruto the chance to notice that the undead creature seemed unnerved by what they had just seen. He personally didn't blame him. "It could have been us. I will do so with joy, your majesty." "See that you do, Lich." With those words, the Lich King departed, leaving his servants behind in his wake. Everything was silently in the arena for a few moments after the master had left, with the exception of the ghouls tearing into their meal. Feeling that something needed to be said to break the silence. "What should we do, Amalthazad-sensei?" said Lich. Took pause at the title that the newest Death Knight in the Scourge gave him. While normally he would demand someone under his command to call him something like Lord or Master, his time in the elemental nations had taught him a little of the new recruit's culture. Sensei, appearance translated to teacher. It wasn't the most grand of titles, but for some reason it seemed right. Besides, none of the other Liches had such a title. It was the sort of thing you could shove down their throats. I guess the first thing we should do is go and get you clothed. We can't have one of the Master's Death Knights walking around naked after all. It would send the wrong kind of message. After that we will need to go and pay the Research and Development Department a visit. Come along, we haven't got all down, Death Knight. With that, both Lich and Death Knight left the arena, leaving the ghouls to feast in private. Some of you may be asking yourselves, how might I best prove my worth to our great master? How might I best earn the right to be granted immortality through undeath? There are many paths to such an enlightened state of being, and not everyone is cut out to reach the heights of our society. Some of you are destined to be reborn as ghouls while others attain the glorious state that is only known to the Liches. Your position in your next life and in what form you are given in it depends greatly on your actions in this life. While serving our great master is a step in the right direction to ensuring your soul is kept safe for all eternity, there is more you can do to earn a greater position in the Scourge when your mortal shell finally reaches the end of its usefulness. The greatest way that you can earn your chance at undeath and feel good about it is to be very giving, generous and caring. Freely give the blessings of an immortal existence to those who let their mortal desires and needs bring them free of the icy cold hand of death. While they might not have earned such a wonderful blessing, without showing such kindness to the unenlightened, the Scourge would lack the vast hordes of soldiers it has at its disposal. Be generous with handing out the blessings of our great and almighty King. It is our great pleasure and our holiest of missions to bring every man, woman and child into the ever-open embrace of the Scourge. To let them rejoice in the glory that is undeath as families, friends and brothers and sisters in arms. Care for those that have just underwent the process of becoming immortal while they adapt to their new forms, and they shall be assured to be cared for when your chance to raise comes. While all of you shall proceed to carry out the Lich King's will, some of you were not born with a talent for magic and might feel that you cannot achieve the same state of enlightenment as your more magically talented brothers and sisters. This is just not true. By spying on those who stand against our master because of fear of the unknown, by disguising yourself as one of them, you will aid the cause. By maintaining and protecting a plague cauldron or helping to spread plagued foodstuffs, you too are giving our master's gift to the world while being generous to those who don't understand yet. By aiding the newly risen, you prove that you care. Remember these words and go out into the world in order to make it a better place. Final page of the Cult of the Damned booklet, Preparing for Undeath. How to gain friends and lose enemies, Ice Crown Citadel. Come along Naruto. If we don't hurry we will have to make an appointment with Professor Putricide, and I refuse to let that insane bastard get a bigger ego than he already has by making both a Lich and a Death Knight make an appointment. Wordlessly, Naruto sped up after his mentor, sensei, advisor. He didn't really know what exactly the relationship between himself and the Lich was, but for the time being the living skeleton was the person he reported to, so he was therefore his boss for the time being. He had admittingly been falling behind a little, but he felt he had a damn good excuse. He had never seen such a place as the Citadel before. It was. Words failed to describe how awesome it truly was. He had never seen a structure this big before in his life, and it was filled with so much activity. Life wasn't the right word to use, since the majority of creatures, beasts and monstrosities walking around could not be considered living creatures. That wasn't to say that there wasn't a total lack of living creatures either. You could see them every now and then, dressed in deep purple robes that covered most of their features, much like the robes he was now wearing did. Either following around someone or something that seemed to be a commanding officer of sorts, helping some of the skeletons and ghouls set something up, or in some cases take advantage of some of the bone piles nearby in order to summon more skeletons and ghouls before ordering them to lend aid to the task at hand. Something that became clear as the journey up the larger-than-life Citadel continued is that the living members of the workforce tended to watch him. Not all of them did it, at least he hadn't caught them doing it, but those that did looked at him in a way that was completely foreign to him, but something he had always felt he dreamed of. They looked towards him with awe, respect, admiration and, in the case of a number of the females, lust. There was at least one case where he had let his eyes linger on a female who was most definitely a female, since her robe was very form-hugging for a little too long. Truth was that the reason he had been looking in the first place was because what little of her skin he could see was a blue-purple color, as well as the fact she had a tail. She noticed him look, smiled at him with naturally purple lips, lipped the words, "I'll be here all day. Come by later if you wish to claim this for yourself," before giving her rear a teasing shake before giving it a rather solid slap. Afterwards, she returned back to her work on whatever she had been doing, ignoring the death glares coming from the rest of the females in the room masterfully. Turning towards his currently rather amused guide, Naruto was still a little stunned when he started asking, what just happened? Amalthazad finished, working overtime not to chuckle at the newly risen servant of the Scourge's expression. Yeah, please tell me that I don't have to explain the whole birds and the bees speech to you. The Lich asked with his voice suddenly being laced with fear at the thought of such an embarrassing situation. Oh god no, Naruto yelled in bone-chilling fear, his voice echoing around the room and drawing the attention of everything there as work ceased for a few moments. Quickly regaining control of himself, the blonde suddenly turned to the surprised audience and asked loudly, "What are you all looking at?" Silently the crowd went back to work on whatever jobs that they had been doing before they had stopped, giving Amalthazad the time he needed to breath out in relief at the fact that they didn't have to go through the damn talk. He was an unholy being of great magical power, not some perverted teacher performing the task that a parent should have done. Look, I know about the who, birds and bees bullshit, but I just want to know why they are looking at me like they have an illness and I'm the only cure? Naruto asked in a much softer voice than before as he continued to talk to the Lich as they started to walk again. Well Naruto, have you ever heard the saying that power is a powerful aphrodisiac? The Lich questioned, causing Naruto to nod a little in confusion. Well, Death Knights are considered to be on par with Liches when it comes to being powerful servants of our master. They are almost just as rare as well. It is a very real possibility that none of the cult of the damned members we have passed by so far have ever seen a Death Knight before. There are also pretty good odds that they will never see another one for the rest of their lives. Fair enough I guess, but is it common for them to want to sleep with any Death Knight that crosses their path? I'm not the one you should be asking that question to. The only other Death Knight I've had the displeasure of knowing for any length of time was Bloodbane. The arrogant fuck kept demanding that the female human members we got paid homage to him while the rest were, what was it? Ah yes, the others were inhuman beasts who shouldn't be allowed to breathe the same air as the rest of us. The cult of the damned as a whole tried to avoid dealing with him whenever possible. Despite not knowing the now dead and gone Bloodbane on a personal level, Naruto couldn't help but feel he did the right thing by getting rid of the prick, regardless of if he had been alive at the time or not. It spoke a lot about someone when both the enemy and the side they're on are better off with them dead and gone. So you don't have this problem personally? Naruto asked innocently enough, a sly grin covering his face as he did. Amalthazad turned his head towards the Death Knight as they started to climb a ramp, his glowing eyes narrowing dangerously. I gave up such petty urges when I ascended to the state of enlightenment as a Lich. Besides, power may be an aphrodisiac, but even it has limits. Now I must warn you about the professor and how he works. Unknown location, most likely a cave. Is there anything new to report on the location of the Kyuubi container Zetsu? The see-through, rainbow-colored representative of the leader of the gather asked, his purple eyes turning to the Venus flytrap-looking man who was the only being physically at the meeting. Of course there is. Why else would I call a meeting like this on such short notice? Zed demanded angrily before Sue stepped in and cut him off before he could say anything more insulting. I am afraid that the container of the Kyuubi is dead and the Kyuubi itself lost. There was a completely dead silence in the cave at the news. Explain. The leader of the organization stated, planning on getting an answer as soon as possible. Because of the nature of the seal on the Kyuubi container, the yang chakra of the nine-tailed beast was locked down by the seal and completely trapped inside of the container when said container died. With its yin and yang chakra separated completely, it is impossible for the Kyuubi to reform itself. While we could normally solve this by simply taking the corpse and finding a way to either undo the seal or extract the yang chakra from the body, the fact that some bastard stole it prevents us from doing this. So until further notice the Kyuubi is off the table. Zed added for good measure. There was a deathly silence as this news quickly spread to everyone at the meeting. A vital piece of their plan had just vanished and they could do nothing about it. Toby wonders how much this changes everything. Toby asked, his head tilted to side in an almost puppy dog-like manner. Let me put it this way. Because the Kyuubi has decided to roll over and die before we could have a crack at it, our plan has gone so far up shit creek without a paddle it isn't worth trying to save. All eyes turned to their leader, silently asking in their own, rather unsure and nervous way, what the fuck do we do now? After a few moments of this uncomfortable silence, Pain spoke. We will continue gathering the other tailed beasts while keeping an eye and an ear open for word of the Kyuubi container's body. Odds are it will turn up sooner or later when someone either tries to use the demonic chakra locked inside it for their own purposes or try to sell it on the black market to those that would. We needed to collect the Kyuubi last anyway. All this does is make the task of collecting him easier. Understood? All those attending the meeting nodded in understanding. The situation wasn't a major problem until the end, by which time it will have hopefully taken care of itself. Dismissed. All of the images vanished with the exception of Zetsu, who stood there alone for a little while. That could have gone worse. Shut up, Sue. With their conversation out of the way, Zetsu sunk into the ground, vanishing without leaving a trace of ever being there at all. Ice-crowned Citadel, 3rd floor, the Plagueworks. There are a couple of ways to describe the Plagueworks located on the 3rd floor of the Citadel, depending on just how nice, artistic or punctual you wish to be at the time. This place looks like what would happen if you created a laboratory in the middle of a damn sewer. Was the first thing that came out of Naruto's mouth at the sight, getting a small nod of agreement from the Lich he reported to. It was also a surprisingly big wing on the floor, made up of a number of different rooms. They had barely entered the wing when they were cut off by a somewhat large gathering of Cult of the Damned members of various species that seemed to be waiting for something. Gather round doomed new interns. The fact that the voice came from behind Naruto didn't bother him as much as just how high-pitched the voice was. It was like listening to a guy that had just gotten his balls kicked in so hard that there was a serious risk he would cough them up. Feeling the metal ground under his feet start to shake a little, Naruto quickly moved to the side, an act that allowed him to avoid getting pushed aside by the rather large thing that was hurrying over to the small crowd. But on a second glance it was easy to see the true speaker who was riding on top of the large monstrosity. He looked like he had once appeared to be a miniature breed of human, but some sort of sickness had ravaged him at one stage, making his skin look horribly green. For some reason, the little man had opted to wear his pink hair in a mohawk. At the sight of his hair, Naruto started having flashbacks of a girl with pink hair punching him in the head, and he was letting her do it? The memory caused Naruto to narrow his eyes a little at the little man riding the monster. Moments ago, I was at work with a friend of mine in the necromancy department, working on the final steps of constructing a flesh giant when I got your page. My friend mistook the ringing crystal as the sign that I was done connecting the right leg and therefore brought the giant to life. The giant walked 2 steps before its leg fell off, causing it to fall to the ground and break apart. Until all the parts are gathered together again in the one place again, I have nothing to do but answer your summons. So here I am. This had better be good. Watching the crowd, Naruto almost laughed when some human-looking guy with a stupid haircut was forcefully pushed to the front in order to answer the pissed-off monster-riding midget like a sacrificial lamb. Sir, the orders say that we were supposed to drain all 8 liters of substance 57 from subject 203, but we counted 9. Should we pump a liter back in? The silence that followed is clearly the calm before the storm. While Naruto couldn't see the midget's face directly, he could just picture a vein that was just about ready to burst appearing on his forehead. That's it. You're all going to run laps around the Citadel until I say stop. The voice that spoke was the kind of calm you get when someone was so mad that it sort of went full circle. There was a small wave of chuckles from the crowd, as if the gnome had just said a funny joke. You think I'm joking? Ick. The monster that the pink-haired gnome was riding on responded to its master's unspoken command. With a surprising turn of speed, its fist connected to the face of the cult member that had been chosen to tell the gnome why he had been summoned. There was the large crack of bone as the mont's body flew into the air, traveling over the heads of the crowd before smacking into the wall with more body-shattering force. When the man hit the ground, his head hung in a weird, unnatural direction. All the cultists started to run, the gnome and his pet, transportation, chasing after them all the while, yelling at them to run faster. After the gnome, his pet and the crowd had run past, the Malthazard slowly glided over to the fallen body of the dead cultist. Lifting his hand slowly, the body began to raise into the air with it. Once it had reached about up to his chest, the Lich held it there for a second before suddenly pointing his hand towards Naruto, yelling, "Catch!" As the body suddenly shot through the air like a meaty rocket. Completely caught off guard by the suddenly turn of events, Naruto made an attempt to catch the corpse that was traveling at high speeds towards him. While he did manage to capture the dead body, the sheer force of the impact was enough to knock him right on his ass. Despite the fact that he didn't hear him, Naruto just knew that the Lich was chuckling on the inside. "We'll bring that with us. The professor can always sew more fresh parts for his work," was all the Lich said to explain his actions before he started to lead the way once more, Naruto grumbling as he forced himself to his feet to follow, carrying the dead weight with him. Northern Fire Country, dirt road in the middle of nowhere. They say that all roads have to lead somewhere. That if you follow a road long enough you will get somewhere sooner or later. This is a lie, however, and many people have died because of it. Roads don't have to lead anywhere, they just have to have somewhere to start. This road, however, lead right to the Konoha, the village hidden in the leaves. Ever since the dead had started rising in the northern parts of Fire Country, civilians of all shapes and sizes had started to flee south as refugees. Many had taken this road because A. Konoha had shinobi trained to deal with this sort of thing, and B. because they also had a very big wall. At the moment, this section of road was empty. The last living thing to pass by was a wagon carrying those who wanted to get some sleep without stopping. If one had good eyesight, you could still see the dust cloud it was trailing behind. Suddenly, a rune-like circle appeared in the middle of the road, glowing brightly against the sunny day. A dome of arcane light quickly takes shape over the circle before vanishing moments later, leaving a woman that hadn't been there before behind. She is dressed in the dark purple robes of her order, one of the few local members who were being returned from the Holy Land of Icecrown to carry out her task. Reaching into one of her pockets, the woman quickly removes an amulet that she slides over her head like a necklace. To someone watching, her appearance would suddenly change as if by magic, which it was. Her richly made clothing becomes nothing more than the common everyday rags of the peasantry, her skin gaining color and imperfections while covering up her beautiful tear-like tattoos on her cheeks. Within seconds, the woman looks just like she had before offering her body and soul to the Lich King and his cause. Looking into the distance and spotting the dust trail, the woman starts to jog in order to catch up to it before nightfall. It wouldn't be too hard to blend in with the others after that. Just another refugee, fleeing to the safety of Konoha to flee the undead monsters that destroyed her village and her life. Without anywhere else to go, she might even stay. Ice-crowned Citadel, 3rd floor, the Plagueworks, Putricide's laboratory of alchemical horrors and fun. Quicken. That really is the name of Professor Putricide's lab. Stepping through the entrance doorway, Naruto was once again reminded of a sewer by the sheer amount of pipes that ran overhead, up and down the walls and sometimes through the floor. Vats and glass containers of green and orange substances bubbles everywhere, leaving only the center of the room with enough space for a table. Currently standing next to the table was what Naruto assumed was Professor Putricide. The undead professor was not alone, however. Strapped quite firmly to the table was a man whose image he had seen in his head far more times than he would have liked. He would rather have not had him in there in the first place. The bastard was struggling in vain against his restraints, on occasion screaming out from the horrible amount of pain he was in. Even someone as medically incompetent as Naruto could tell that having your chest cut open, having all your organs exposed to the outside world, and then having someone who looked like they had recently dug themselves out of their grave go to great and somewhat insane efforts to break off your ribs one by one had to hurt like all fucking hell. Naruto grinned at the sight. Such a thing couldn't be happening to a nicer person. Ribs reinforced by unknown energy source. Normal human bones would only require a fraction of my physical abilities to snap off, but for you I have to use the aid of a hammer. Interesting. Professor, pardon our interruption, but what have you discovered so far? The Malthazard asked aloud, catching the scientist off guard by the new arrivals. What? When did you arrive? How did you manage to get past my anti-invader moths? Naruto and Amalthazard both blinked at the sudden swarm of questions. Despite the fact that they both knew the man was a complete and utter crackpot before they had even got here, being confronted with said insanity was a whole different ballgame. Fortunately, Naruto had dealt with such crazy people in the past. I'm afraid the only moths I saw were staked out on a code rack at the door, and neither of us had a code. Seemingly forgotten about the man whose insides were currently showed to the world at large strapped tightly to his table, the professor suddenly went to bang his fist on his table, only to get a weird little wet noise and a loud coughing fit of pain when his fist landed on one of the captured shinobi's lungs. Damn it, how could I have failed to see such a basic flaw in my mods? The unwanted invader isn't going to take the time to hang his coat on the coat rack. They are far too barbaric to undergo such a civilized and polite act. Therefore my flesh-eating moths won't be triggered. Whether or not the moths really did eat flesh was a question that Naruto knew he would one day have to con someone else into finding out. Today, however, he had other, more important issues to take care of. Don't worry, Professor. I'm sure one day someone will invent a home invader that is polite enough to use the coat rack. Your flesh-eating moths wouldn't have been made in vain. Making a polite home invader. Interesting idea, and if you don't mind leaving that body you've got over there, I might get started on it as soon as I'm done taking this shinobi apart and figuring out how they work. The professor stated, his blood-soaked hand rubbing his chin as he contemplated the idea of making someone to invade his labs solely to trigger his defenses. Deciding that now that they were on relatively good terms with the undead mad scientist, Naruto walked over to a small pile of various bodies, dumping the dead cultist he was carrying on top of it, listening to the conversation all the while. So what have you discovered so far, Professor? These shinobi, as you've called them, are wonderful test subjects. Just reanimating this one alone gave me a new piece of interesting news. The way the professor said, interesting, was often more commonly used to say, bad. However, there was still a rather keen interest there. How so, Professor? The Lich asked as Naruto returned to stand by him, once more seeming to ignore the man struggling on the table in order to have a very important and adult conversation. A thing that one sorely misses when the only person near you with something like a brain was Bloodbane. Well, for starters, it would appear that this follow was raised by necromancy and exists in an undead state without having once heard the Lich King voice in his head or have the sense of loyalty to the Scourge that all risen by the plague gain upon their rebirth. He is like the Forsaken, with the major difference being that he was never loyal to our glorious monarch to begin with. At the professor's words, a strange silence filled the room with the exception of the man's struggles and sharp intakes of breath that suggested pain and the bubbling of unknown liquids. For some reason, despite not understanding the situation, Naruto felt horrified at the very thought of the man not even hearing the words of his lord. How can this be? I was raised and I could hear our Lord's words in my mind as clearly, if not more so than my own. Is this common? The profession shook his head before answering, his jaw coming loose a little, forcing him to put it back into place before it fell off again. I do not yet understand how such a thing has happened yet, but then I have only just began gathering information from this being. I might find the answer later on. However, glancing between both the man strapped to the table and Naruto, Putricide started to rub his chin as an idea ran through his head. I believe that the reason you can hear our king and this poor unfortunate soul might have something to do with the ways you were granted the gift of undeath. While this man underwent his rebirth through the use of lower-tier necromancy, a fate commonly used to raise ghouls and lower-level undead, you were brought back into this world as a death knight, an act that our king himself must have undertaken. You cannot get much higher grade than that. While it is not unheard of for some undead to reject our lord and master, it normally takes outside forces to break the connection between them first. To be raised in Icecrown, inside the Citadel itself, and not feel the will of our lord. The Lich began, more shocked than afraid of the thought. Of course, this could very well just be a special case. One soldier does not an army make after all. We will need to get our hands on some more shinobi and use different means to try and bless them with undeath before we can publicly proclaim any conclusions to His Highness. Only 2 conflicting test samples are not enough. Other than the man I've currently got on ice, do you have any other test subjects I could use? I'm afraid not. Any other samples I might have collected were damaged too badly to be used by the fool Bloodbane. I heard that asshole was gone. Good news for everyone. Glad to be rid of him personally. Always made fun and picked on my children, the big bully. Rotface and Festergut have only recently stopped crying and started coming out of their rooms again. I had to make them puppies in order to make them feel better about themselves after that bastard had a crack at them last time he was here. Still not sure what would happen if they met a death knight right now, even if it isn't that prick. Maybe I should wait outside then? I don't want to cause them to have a relapse if they saw me and mistook me for him. Naruto asked, his hand rubbing the back of his neck the whole time. He really didn't like the idea of causing the professor's kids any more pain than they had already suffered. Putricide actually seemed to grin at the suggestion. It's nice to have a Death Knight that isn't a complete asshole in here for a change. While my children can get temperamental at times, they tend to have short memories when it comes to painful things. If you come back in a week or so, I'll introduce you to them. But right now they are outside playing in the snow, so you don't have to worry about it. Now then, I guess you've come here to find out more about your abilities, yes? Then do me a favor and tear out that rib there. It's in the way and I want to have a look at his lungs. The punch I gave it earlier should have punctured it. When approaching one of the non-blessed miners, take great care. Some will merely complain about hearing voices in their head, along with the standard curses and insults towards your person for trusting in the power of our Lord and Master. This is to be expected. Others will start preaching off about some false god and either A. try to remove your brain with a pickaxe or B. try to remove their own brain with a pickaxe. This is also to be expected and is exactly why you should never wander around without an armed escort at all times. Despite the many positive things about Serenite, this is one of its greatest dirty little secrets. While we are not completely sure what the connection truly is, those who reject the strength and guidance of our mighty king will be driven insane by the voice of the old god Yogg Saron. Beware the whispers of this fiend, for he will attempt to test your faith and drive you as insane as the poor mortal non-believers. Despite the effects only taking place where large amounts of Serenite are gathered, our Lord and Master's power is more than a match for the corrupted monster hidden somewhere under the frozen earth of our darkness-blessed land of Northrend. Not only is our king immune to this foul creature's mind-breaking corruption, but those who pledge themselves to him in both life and death are safeguarded from the voices of the old gods as well. Remember to keep your faith in our Master undying and you will be able to join the final march on the lair of the cursed god Yogg Saron with relative safety when the Master decides to end that foul monster once and for all. The Cult of the Damned Foreman's Guide, Chapter 6, Hidden Dangers of Mining Serenite, Somewhere in the frozen plains of Icecrown. So what exactly is we doing out here? Naruto asked, following the Lich at a respectable distance. However, instead of the answer he wanted to hear, all Naruto got in return was a, "You will see when we get there." It hadn't been so long ago that the two of them had been in the professor's lab. Despite the fact that Putricide was somewhat insane, Naruto couldn't help but like the man. To him, the professor was a man who had long ago abandoned what others thought of him while doing everything in his power to make his often insane and twisted dreams a reality. It was a very respectable trait that few people ever truly achieved. Still, after they had left the lab with a promise from the professor that he wouldn't rest until he had discovered just why the shinobi's organs were resistant to the rot, the more common of scourge plagues, a test that caused a satisfying amount of pain to the bastard, Naruto felt, Amalthazad had requested that Naruto join him out on the frozen plains. Following the Lich over the everlasting ice and snow that made up the heart of the Scourge Empire, Naruto couldn't help but glance over the wind-swept plains. Icecrown was a death trap to the living. Nothing could grow here, the temperature, wind and ice made sure of that. The same things that prevented plants from growing also kept those who didn't wish to freeze to death away from the place. It was rather suiting that the Scourge picked one of the few places on the planet that was outright hostile to those who needed warmth to stay alive to set up their homeland. But once you managed to get past the cold and the lack of food, one could see the true beauty that the place defended from the corruption of the living so mercilessly. Despite the lack of sun or moonlight, things that were lost because of the seemingly endless cloud cover, the snow and ice still managed to glow. "We are here," was all Amalthazad announced as they both stopped at what seemed to be just another random field of ice and snow. Looking around at the location, Naruto couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "And just what is it we are doing out here?" The once human skeleton turned in mid-air, giving Naruto the impression that if he could, Amalthazad would be smiling at him. "We are here to teach and train you to become the true agent of the Scourge you were brought back to be, Death Knight. Konoha, Public Library. Alright, you have to bring this book back in 2 weeks' time. Feel free to come back before then though." With a thump of her rubber stamp, the transaction was complete. "Thank you, Ms." was all the 8-year-old girl said, happy that she had borrowed out her first book. As the girl over to her older sister, the library assistant that had performed the transaction smiled kindly as she returned to her task of organizing the books that had been returned and figuring out where they were meant to go. Such a kind, sweet child. When the time comes, I'll make sure her whole family gets the blessing of undeath so that they can be happy together forever. The woman thought to herself, happy that she had the means to make such a joyous thing happen for someone else. It hadn't taken too long for her to catch up with the wagon. Getting into Konoha, however, was much harder, but she was able to get in because she was well and truly a civilian. She had simply used the name she had used in her former life, an alias that worked better than any that could have been made up by a professional forger. It had even been backed up by people who had once lived in her village but escaped before the plague had swept through. The plague that she had brought there. While she only caught a peep into the world of the cult of the damned, she already could tell that those who joined came to it for different reasons. Many came for money, power, the chance to live forever. She had joined to find out who had murdered her sister. Her sister had been married for years to a man who had turned to hard sake in order to deal with his problems. While she never spoke of it to anyone, there was evidence that it was an abusive relationship. Then one day she turned up dead in the river. At first everyone said that she had drowned by accident, but when the two large bruises that looked like handprints were discovered, that was quickly ruled out as the cause of death. But not a single person publicly accused her sister's husband, and by legal rights, her own brother-in-law, of the murder, since despite his drinking problem he was still a wealthy and somewhat well-liked member of their village. There was no proof to connect him to the death of his wife because since nobody wanted to look for it, it vanished. Unwilling to let the murderer of her sister get away with his crimes, she had looked long and hard to find a way to speak with the only witness to her sister's death that would willingly tell her the truth. The spirit of her dead sister. It was this desire for justice that caused her to find the cult of the damned. In exchange for her loyalty, she was given what she sought. When she spoke to the ghost of her sister spoke of all the hateful crimes that her husband committed against her that she was far too ashamed to speak of in life. When Baron Bloodbane gave her a plant and told her what to do with it, she had obeyed, making sure that her murderous brother-in-law was the first to be raised into undeath, resulting in his beheading and the burning of his body after her murdered his two best drinking buddies in a mindless rage. Placing the last book onto the shelf it was meant to go on, the woman blinked as she came back to the here and now, giggling a little at how foolish she had been to get caught up in her own thoughts. It was almost scary just how much free time you had to think about everything when you were so used to your job you could do it in your sleep. Turning around to head back to her little service desk, the woman almost ran right into someone who was looking at the few books on tracking that the library was permitted to have. Looking the woman over, her white eyes quickly gave away her family. She seemed lost in thought about something. "Pardon me, Ms." the librarian asked, shocking the girl out of her trance and causing her to turn the color of a strawberry, most likely ashamed of being caught lost in her own thoughts in a public place. Once the shock wore off, the girl seemed to shift to a more confident stance, but there was something defeated about her. You couldn't see just what it was, but you could just tell by looking at her that something had gone horrible wrong for her. "Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't in your way, was I?" the girl asked, her voice fighting a losing battle to stay steady. The cultist shook her head as an answer, trying to place where she had seen this sort of behavior before. "Not at all, Ms. Hinata. Ms. Hinata, you weren't in the way at all. But might you tell me what you are looking for? I might be able to help you find it." "I'm sorry, but I don't think you could help me find what I've lost, Ms. Amy. If you're sure I can't help you right now, I guess I should get back to work. But if you ever feel like talking, I'm always here." "Thank you, Amy. I'll remember you if I need to speak to someone." Giving the Hyuga a respectful nod as a way of departing, Amy smiled warmly as she headed back to her desk job. She knew her name. She knew the family. All she had to do now was find out about the person. The girl was hurting, longing for something. The sooner Amy discovered what that something was, the more time she would have to come up with a plan to approach the young woman. Her gifts would serve her master nicely, and it would make Amy feel good if she could honestly help the girl out with her problem. Whatever it might be. Ice Crown, middle of nowhere. What sort of training? I thought you didn't know anything about chakra? Naruto asked, suddenly paying a great deal of attention to the Lich. Amalthazad chuckled at the eagerness of his student. This would be both a gift and a burden for the ivory blonde Death Knight during his first trial of the Path of Frost. While I still do not fully understand the nature of chakra and how to manipulate it, that is not what I am here to train you in. What do you understand about your current state of being, Death Knight? Naruto paused at the question. How much about his current situation did he truly understand? Not a lot, if he was honest with himself. I know that I am a Death Knight. I know that Death Knights are quite rare, but I don't really know just why that is. Other than that, I don't really know. Naruto confessed truthfully. Not unexpected. The Lich sighed aloud, putting one of his claw-like hands to his forehead to rub his skull, finding it slightly annoying that he was the one to have to explain this. Death Knights are considered amongst the strongest of the Scourge because they are considered one of the few true great works of necromancy. You don't age, you don't have to eat, sleep or drink, and unlike most lesser undead you have something akin to the mind you once had. However, that isn't important to you right now. What matters is the trio. The trio? Naruto asked, thinking that the name wasn't that well thought out. Whenever a Death Knight is created from the fallen, either spiritually or physically, their bodies are infused with 3 of the primary dark magics of the Scourge, which was rather foolishly nicknamed the trio by some of the cult years ago. Sadly, the name stuck. But it is important that you learn how to use these gifts granted to you as quickly as possible if you are to provide proper assistance when we return to the elemental nations. Naruto didn't really remember anything more than images and flashes from his days amongst the living, but he did remember he had always been ready and eager to learn some new jutsu or attack. It was a trait that he was glad to see he had kept in the transaction from living to undead. So what are these new dark magics I've got then? Naruto asked, quickly becoming very excited at the thought of what he could do now. The Lich chuckled a little darker than before. He was right. What he was about to get this boy to do was going to be a form of sheer torture for him. It gave him that small, warm feeling that all teachers get when doing right by their students makes them suffer a little. It wouldn't be a true education without a little pain after all. The 3 schools of magic that the Scourge practice come down to 3 primal elements: blood, frost and unholy. As a Lich, I do not practice blood magic and there are better teachers to train you in wielding the unholy powers you can command. I will be teaching you in the arts of frost or ice magic, if you wish to call it such. Images of a girl's image in a dome of mirrors made of ice flashed through Naruto's mind. It was a rather comforting memory, despite the nature of it. I believe I met someone in the elemental nations years ago who was naturally born with the ability to create and use ice jutsu. I think she is dead through, and that she was the last of her kind, Naruto finished sadly. Oddly enough, the Lich seemed to pause at the news for a few moments before sighing. A true shame. I would have liked to have compared that so-called Kekkei Genkei to the frost magics of the Liches. It would have been interesting to see the result. Oh well. Clearing his throat, Amalthazad got back to the whole reason they were here in the first place: business. We will have plenty of time to practice your frost abilities much later on, since we will be working together for the foreseeable future, but now is the best time to at least unlock your powers over ice, here at the coldest place on the planet. Do you know anything about meditation? When Naruto gave a small nod, Amalthazad continued, then please, take off your clothing and take a spot on the snow. Despite the sheer oddness of the request, Naruto did it rather quickly. The cold didn't really bother him despite the fact it should be causing enough frostbite to kill him, and the only thing that would possibly bear witness to him being naked out here was Amalthazad, who had long ago removed his own flesh and muscle in order to reach lichdom in the first place. Once the clothing was removed, Naruto simply folded it up nicely and placed it on the ground a little away from himself as he took a cross-legged seat in the snow. Amalthazad nodded his approval at Naruto's ability to follow an order without hesitation. There were far too many Death Knights that kept a sense of modesty that sort of got in the way at times. I want you to clear your mind of everything else and focus solely on the ice, snow and freezing cold wind around you. I want you to embrace the cold into your own body and heart, aligning yourself with it completely. Once you have aligned yourself with the frozen heart of Ice Crown, you will be able to tap the frost magic that is a part of your very being at will. Even if in the end you chose to master a different element completely, once you access the ice magic running through you will always been able to use it at will. I will know when you have succeed. You are to remain as you are until I return and tell you otherwise. You may begin. With that one order, Naruto closed his eyes, seeking to achieve the state of being that Amalthazad had asked of him. The Lich waited a few minutes before he started to float back to the Citadel. He had a small gift for his new partner that needed to be prepared. Besides, it would still take a few days at least before Naruto to connect to the ice magic flowing through him, and the Lich would know the moment he had succeed. He had other things he needed to do in the meantime. Unknown location, elemental nations. A creature that had existed for more than tens of thousands of years began to chuckle at the world above it. While its plans for freedom were still underway and they were nearing completion, that was not why this creature was happy. The happiness was because it was having so much fun playing with its little toys on the surface of the world. Another of its kind might have simply driven the humans above them completely insane and been done with it, but this creature took great pleasure in its little mind games. Their minds were so guarded, so secure. It took years to truly drive them mad, and what sweet madness it was. If it had simply tried to crush the minds of the humans above, far too many for his liking would have resisted the crushing force of reality. But this way, a small twist of a plan here, a small idea implanted there, enraging or enlarging an ego somewhere else, and it got to witness his horrific things that made it smile so sweetly. It had many pawns in the world above, even if only one of them was a true believer in its power. It had just used one to eliminate the last of the original Guardian's pets. It was a truly good year. All it had to do now was wait for his worshipper to complete the rest of the plan to gain its freedom from its earthly prison. Might as well play around a little more in the meantime. Ice Crown, middle of nowhere, 4 days later. Despite the fact that a minor snowstorm had blown through Ice Crown the day before, Amalthazad still found back-tracing his steps the day before rather easy. Mostly, this was because he could float over the snow no matter how deep or dangerous it was to step on. The ghouls following him had a much harder time going, but they clawed their way through the snow and ice easily enough. When they reached the spot that the Lich had left Naruto, all they found was freshly fallen snow and ice as far as the eye could see, with no sign that there was any form of life nearby, either living or undead. The ghouls didn't question the command of the Lich when he said, "Start digging." It took a good 15 minutes to remove enough snow to uncover the stiff corpse that looked like it had been frozen solid before it had even been buried. Ice hung from blonde hair that could be mistaken for ivory, while Naruto's body was turned a deep blue color. He was still sitting in the cross-legged position that he had been in when the Lich had left him here. If Naruto had still been living, he would have been long dead by now. One of the dumber ghouls stumbled towards the body that looked like a frozen piece of meat, muttering something about free meal between animistic growls. Just before it managed to get close enough to reach the blonde in order to take a bite, Amalthazad spoke only 3 words at the sight. "It is time." Before the ghoul even knew what hit it, a blue pulse stuck it in the head and chest. It didn't make a sound for a few seconds before falling backwards, its head breaking apart as it impacted with the ground like a cheaply made glass cup, shattering in shards of frozen flesh, blood and skull fragments. Naruto's left arm had moved so quickly that some of the shards of ice that had grown on his flesh had torn into the limb a little, but for the most part he ignored whatever pain it might have caused him. With a great deal of cracking, his eyes opened, the unnatural blue glow shining brighter than normal due to the ice that still covered most of his body. With much greater care than he had taken with his left arm, Naruto began to move his limbs and body again, breaking off and brushing off ice and snow of his person respectfully. Standing up slowly in order to avoid harming his legs in the process, Naruto began to move his limbs with great care in order to warm up the frozen blood in his veins. It wasn't painful or anything, but it did make him rather stiff. "How long have I been here?" was the first question the blonde asked, seemingly not noticing the dead ghoul. 4 days. I'm glad to see that you used that time wisely. Amalthazad replied, inspecting the shattered glass like figments that had once been a ghoul's head. Despite enjoying the praise, Naruto's attention was elsewhere, searching the ground nearby for something that clearly wasn't there anymore. "By any chance you didn't dig up the clothing I had before, did you?" Naruto asked, already expecting the worst but hoping for the best anyway. "Odds are those things blew away in the snowstorm that passed though yesterday." Naruto sighed at the answer. He suspected that if he was seen by just one of the many female cult of the damned members in this state, more would come and he would be completely mobbed, regardless of what anyone did. Death by fangirls. He didn't like his odds of getting a second chance if that happened. I did however foresee such a thing happening though. This seemed like the best time to introduce you to your new armor as well. Was all the Lich said as one of the ghouls that had come with him dropped a package in the snow in front of Naruto. Taking his time in picking up the package, mostly due to his stiff body parts, Naruto tore into the package with careful ease. While the flesh wound on his left arm had been tiny and had healed itself by this point, his oxygen-lacking blood hadn't completely unfrozen yet. The first things that came out of the bundle was an undershirt and a pair of underwear, which the blonde thankfully put on. With the whole modesty issue taken care of, Naruto took out and slowly inspected each piece before putting it on. The first item looked like it was designed to be a chest piece. It was made out of some sort of leather that Naruto had never seen before, with pieces of the dark blue metal that Bloodbane's armor had been made out of woven through the leather, reinforcing it nicely without impairing movement. Sliding it over his head, Naruto was surprised at just how light it was. He might as well have been wearing something made of normal everyday cloth. The next item to draw his attention were a pair of pants that matched the chest piece in design and function, using the bluish-black metal to offer some protection while keeping movement completely free of impairment. Putting them on as well, Naruto turned his attention back to the package, removing what looked like a pair of arm guards. Unlike the armor so far, the arm guards were completely made out of the blue-black metal. Sliding his arm carefully into one of them, Naruto noticed that it covered his forearm till just under the elbow, sticking to the theme of movement first. Placing the other one on, Naruto noticed the slightest of differences between the two around the bottom of his right wrist. Twisting his hand upwards to press down on the difference, a rather sharp spike slid out from under his right wrist, surprising Naruto a little at the sheer speed that the metal had moved. Once he was over his shock, he examined the blade in silence, taking note of the fact it looked like it could tear through metal with relative ease. Flesh and bone wouldn't have a prey. Removing the weight of his right wrist off the little bottom in the arm guard, the metal spike returned to the hiding spot from whence it came. Planning to play with his new toys later, Naruto quickly looked at the last two items that came with the armor. Shin guards, made from the same metal as the arm guards. Other than being forced to sit down in order to put them on, there wasn't any hidden little tricks built into them. They just served the simple purpose of protecting his shins from harm. Not overly impressive, but useful nonetheless. Looking down at himself, Naruto grinned a little at the sight of multiple shades of dark and darker blue. He wasn't quite sure how he looked yet since he couldn't see his reflection, but he had a feeling that he must have looked downright badass. The leather in that armor is made from the hide of a downed frost rim. When you start learning to control the unholy energy inside of you, your teacher will show you a somewhat useful trick you can do with your armor. Amalthazad explained, reminding Naruto that the Lich was still standing there. I love the armor and everything, not how come there aren't any shoes? Naruto asked, lifting one of his bare feet to support the argument. For the first time since he had met him, Naruto saw Amalthazad look a little sheepish. Or at least as sheepish as a 13-foot-tall skeleton with enough magical power to cause widespread destruction at will could be. We didn't know your shoe size when we made the armor. The Lich explained, feeling a little stupid for doing so. There was a slightly awkward silence for a few moments with nothing but the howling wind to break it. So what happens now? Naruto asked, interested in what the next step was. Simple really. Amalthazad stated with certainty, the awkwardness forgotten. We go find your other two teachers so that you can learn to harness the powers that are your given right to wield. So where do we find someone to teach me then? Naruto asked, already building up his eagerness to learn, if for no other reason than to move around a little bit to help speed up the defrosting of his blood. Thankfully, we will find what we seek in the same place. We have to go to the Plague Lands. What defines something as holy or unholy? This is a rather interesting question that is often debated by not only ourselves but almost every creature capable of thought regardless of its status amongst the living, dead, undead or otherwise. For example, the night elves who live in the forests of northern Kalimdor believe that nature is sacred and should be safeguarded, while things such as arcane or fell magics are unnatural in their eyes and need to be stomped out as quickly as possible. However, the High Elves embrace arcane magic with the same passion that Night Elves view nature. Of course, this has pitted them against each other on a number of occasions due to their different values and beliefs. The so-called Blood Elves take this one step further, drawing forth fell magics in order to help deal with their addiction to magic. This has caused great stress in diplomatic relations with their fellow elves, who both share the view that fell magic is unholy, the tool of demons and their servants and slaves. The debate of what is holy and what isn't has divided the elven people into these factions. And they are not the only ones. Almost all the different races are divided by such beliefs with the exception of 3. Demons, goblins and the Scourge. While demons do not bother debating over things such as holy and unholy, they divide themselves through greed and petty power struggles. Goblins also don't care about such things as holy or unholy, letting their capitalism remove the need for such things. To them, holy or unholy are merely words that can add an extra bonus to their paychecks. But like the demons, they let their greed and lust for power at all costs divide them. The Scourge is united in the purpose of fulfilling the Lich King's will. It doesn't really matter how we achieve this task. We will use any and all tools that are useful in furthering our goals. Holy, unholy, doesn't really matter. In the end, all it comes down to is perception. If something is holy or unholy is a personal matter. It is completely up to you. Chapter 1 of best-selling book, Unholy or Just Harmless Fun, made highly popular for Chapter 7's in-depth description on how to summon succubi and other lust demons. Western Plaguelands, Scholomance. The room had been prepared for this sort of thing beforehand, even if it wasn't for this case exactly. As one of the key strongholds of the Scourge, it was expected to be a staging area for raids and invasions into non-Scourge-held lands, such as those to the south, west and north of the Plaguelands. As such, commanders and leaders needed to be able to come and go as they pleased, which led to the creation of this room. Apart from the vast amount of glowing runes and magical symbols all over the walls and the large circle of runes in the center of the floor, the room itself was completely bare. It was clearly a room meant for people to suddenly appear in blindly. Which was what was happening now, as the room seemed to be lost in a powerful glow for a few seconds before the runes started to dim again, leaving an amused Lich and a Death Knight on his hands and knees trying to dry heave in its wake. "Don't be such a cry-baby. It wasn't that bad," Amalthazad stated, trying to prevent the chuckle from escaping his teeth, since that was the closest thing he had to lips anymore, at the sight of Naruto on the ground, overreacting to the teleportation in his opinion. It really was a rather funny sight to see. Everyone reacted to the teleport spell differently after all. "You think it wasn't that bad? I feel like an 8-year-old boy who was just unlucky enough not to be torn apart by a mob of middle-aged pedophiles." Naruto grumbled as he waited for his stomach to sort itself out. He might not have been able to get sick, but that wasn't from a lack of trying in this case. Amalthazad couldn't help himself as he started to chuckle without restraint, finding the blonde's reaction to the whole situation to be just so goddamn funny. "And just how do you know what it feels like to be the center of attention of a mob of pedophiles, Naruto?" The blank stare that Naruto gave the Lich could only be found in nature, the oh-so-famous deer caught in the headlights of a goblin bike. "Look. Did you just crack a joke about pedophiles?" The Lich merely grinned knowingly to himself as he started to float towards the open door, Naruto grumbling as he got to his feet about smart-arsed bone people. After walking down a couple of hallways in complete silence, Naruto started to take in just where they were. It looked like some sort of underground lair that seemed to ring a bell in his memory, but it was a lot less Spartan than the memory. Everywhere where he looked there was something new to lay your eyes on. There were books, bones, banners, arcane circles of runes and even a stuffed crocodile hanging up from the ceiling. That last one made Naruto pause mid-step in order to make sure that he had indeed seen the stuffed water-based reptile and he hadn't merely gone completely insane. The thing was there all right. It was just hanging there with its jaws wide open, wearing a bright purple wizard's hat with white stars on it and sunglasses covering its eyes. Its tongue was hanging out with a large diamond ring pieced through it like a tongue stud. Hearing the blonde put his foot down and not continuing on, the Lich turned around to see what had made Naruto stop in his tracks. "So, you noticed the croc then? I've never seen anything like this before. What's it doing here anyway?" It's a very fundamental part of magic. The stuffed croc hanging from the ceiling is as traditional as the cauldron or the robes. Not having it could be highly dangerous. Yikes, I guess it really is important then. More than you could possibly understand, since from what I've discovered from your people they don't practice traditional magic. Fair enough, I guess. So what exactly does it do? What do you mean? If this thing is so damn important to whatever magic is used here, what the hell does it do? The deathly silence that followed this question was so thick that crickets couldn't even pierce it. You don't actually know what it's meant to be used for, do you? We don't have time for such childish questions. Your teacher in the unholy arts is waiting for us. Hey, don't change the subject. Get back here and answer the bloody question. Bloody know-it-all licks, Naruto muttered to himself as he gave chase to the floating bag of bones. For a few moments, they walked down the hallways in silence, stepping past, around, or in some cases over the odd cult of the damned member or undead locals. As they started to take a set of steps downwards, Naruto finally broke the silence between them. So who exactly are we here to see, anyway? We are going to meet one of the greatest wielders of the unholy arts the Scourge has ever had. A former paladin of the Order of the Silver Hand named Roker. The Lich answered, floating down the steps with a graceful ease. Paula what? Naruto asked, his head tilted in confusion at the title. Is that sort of like a chunin or something? Amalthazad took a moment to try and figure out just how to explain what a paladin was. Such a thing didn't really exist in the elemental nations from what he had been able to tell. It was one of the reasons he liked it there so bloody much. A paladin is a holy then thou stuck-up arsehole that undergoes military and religious training to the point that their zealot-like deviation grants them a range of magical powers devoted to smiting the wicked, serving the greater good blah blah blah. Most Death Knights were paladins at one time or another, but they gave up the powers their zealotry gave them when they abandoned their faith and joined us. Pausing for a moment, the Lich felt it important to add, well, expect for one. But in all fairness, we haven't really converted him yet. We're just controlling his body like a puppet until we can make him see our point of view. No point locking him up somewhere and letting him go to waste after all. Nodding his head due to understanding the logic behind this cause of action, curiosity ran over Naruto like the cat associated with its namesake. While he still didn't understand exactly what a paladin was, he knew the kind of religious stuck-up pricks that might just rival them. So if he was once a stuck-up prick with magical powers, how did he end up being a Death Knight then? While I don't know all the facts, the tale of how Roker rose to being a Death Knight is one of the more well-known ones. You see, most paladins are brought low because they lusted for money, power or revenge, and their faith in their religion was broken because of it. Roker's faith was broken by love of all things. Love? You've got to be kidding. I kid you not. Roker fell in love with a priestess of the Holy Light. I don't think anyone living, dead or otherwise knows her name other than Roker himself anymore. Anyway, our young paladin spent years trying to win her heart. He brought her wonderful gifts, performed great and often dangerous tasks in her name at her request, went shoe shopping with her, and most likely a countless number of other hells that all men in love go through when they're trying to woo their chosen one. In the end, Roker was thrown out of the Order of the Silver Hand because he let his feelings for the priestess get in the way of his duty. When he went to see her again, she turned him away. Since he was no longer a member of the order, she said, he no longer had the status to date a priestess like herself. The image of a pink-haired girl punching him in the head flashed through Naruto's confused mind. He didn't know who she was, but he suspected that he might have been a part of a rather destructive relationship with her at some point. Shaking the thought from his mind, the blonde banished the memory back to the past. It wasn't important to him anymore. That memory belonged to him when he was alive, and now that that chapter of his, pun intended, life was over, all he could do now was move on and embrace undeath to the best of his abilities. Let it not be said that he was one to back down from new challenges. The next day, during some sort of religious meeting or whatever it is that those light-worshipping sheep do when they flock to a church, Roker kicked down the door with a small band of hired thugs. Within minutes, they had crippled or disabled every single person in that building. It was at this point that Roker reportedly found the priestess who was his ex and tied her to the main altar before raping her in front of the whole coronation. After he was done, he tore off whole chunks of her skin and broke her arms and legs before exiting the church. Once he and his thugs were outside, they sealed every entrance and exit of the church shut before setting the place ablaze with everyone inside of it being burned alive. 2 hours later, Roker walked into the nearest Scourge-held outpost and offered his body and soul to the Lich King. He has been with us ever since. Naruto felt sick again. It was a strange feeling that should have been impossible for something that had not only ceased to be alive but had been raised from the grave again through dark means to feel, but he defied all expectations once again. A part of him wanted to hurl, but the majority kept itself in control. That seems rather over the top for something like revenge, doesn't it? Naruto managed to ask, his voice losing a little bit of its nerve as he asked it. The Lich picked up on the weakness right away, but for the time being decided to put it aside for now, assuring himself that it was merely because the boy was still newly raised from the grave. He would grow out of it sooner or later. Well, whether you agree with his tactics or not, there is no denying that Roker is one of the Scourge's greatest death knights when it comes to the matter of unholy magics. He is third only to the Lich King and the Major Dome themselves. Scholomance, Bone Pit. Roker was unhappy. Ever since being reborn as a Death Knight, he had little cause not to be happy. He got to rape, pillage and slaughter to his black heart's content, and not only did his lord and master approve of his practices, he encouraged them. It was the kind of employee-boss relationship that people would have killed for. He knew he had, but now the powers that be had pulled him away from the carnage that he loved in order to show some new meat, the bloody ropes. It did stroke his ego a little that when it came to showing the new guy how to be an unholy bastard, he was the first person they contacted, but still, it was a slight annoyance to get pulled away from his fun and pleasure to deal with this. "Is this the new runt?" was all Roker asked as a Lich he hadn't seen before entered the room, escorting what could only have been the new Death Knight to have ascended to their ranks. He wasn't impressed. Sure, he had heard the stories of Bloodbane's death by the new guy's hands, but Bloodbane was an arrogant dumb ass. 2 drugged-up goblins and a drunken priest would have been more than enough to take that stupid asshole down. Naruto for his part actually growled a little at the runt comment, only to be waved into silence by Amalthazad. Yes, he is the new Death Knight that is taking Bloodbane's old spot. I am sure you know why we are here then? Of course I do. You want me to teach the little runt the most unholy arts of the damned. How to wield his dark gifts given to him to the best of his abilities, blah blah blah, something along those lines, right? Roker asked, raising an unseen eyebrow under his helmet as if daring them to say they were here for something else. That pretty much covers why we are all here rather nicely. The question is, can you teach him? Was all Amalthazad asked. At the end of the day, that was the only question during this conversation that needed to be answered. Naruto showed a surprising amount of tact and remained silent during the exchange, although the jab at his height was rather annoying. Seemingly thinking about it for a moment, Roker examined the potential student. Going so far as to stand up from the makeshift bone throne he had been sitting on, the older Death Knight examined the younger one in such a way that Naruto couldn't help but feel that the man would have been able to see into his soul if he still processed it. "Tell me, runt, were you a warlock in life?" Wasn't a question that Naruto had been expecting to be asked, but nonetheless he recovered quite quickly. "No, at least, I don't think so. What exactly is a warlock?" Roker's gaze turned to the Lich with surprising speed. There was a clear level of anger in his eyes that could clearly be seen under the helm he was wearing. "I'm sorry, but has the IQ standard suddenly been fucking dropped since I was raised? How the hell did someone who doesn't even know what a fucking warlock is ever earned the Lich King's blessing? Has His Highness changed suddenly without anyone knowing? Last I checked he would have put this fool down for stupidity." Naruto felt the growl rise in his throat. He really wanted to tear into this asshole, but he was smart enough to know that he needed this asshole's help. If he was to simply rip him a new one, it would not help in the long run anyway, yet. For now, he would remain silent, letting Amalthazad speak on his behalf. For now, Naruto here is from the Elemental Nations, the recently discovered block of land to the east. While they do have some breed of magic there, it's more related to shamanism and voodoo than traditional magic. While there are demons there, most of them are just large animal spirit gods with the wrong title. They don't really have what we would call a warlock. Amalthazad explained, getting a look of interest from not just Roker but Naruto as well. "You mean to tell me that they are basically human versions of those bloody trolls in Zuldrak with their so-called empire?" Roker asked, his eyebrow rose in curiosity this time. Thinking about that explanation for a moment, Amalthazad was able to see just how well it worked in this situation. They are to a fairly decent extent, yes. However, they are much smarter and better organized than the trolls are. They even have the same basic form of government of just a bunch of small tribes serving under a single ruler, with the sole expectation that instead of one centralized power there are at least 5 major power players controlling the continent. The shinobi culture there is sort of like a mixture of orc honor, goblin greed, troll voodoo, night elf druidism and shamanism and human treachery. Sounds like a fun place to grow up, Roker remarked with a grin on his face, wondering a little when he would get a chance to see the place for himself. New lands to defile were hard to find after all. It was, Naruto answered, not really understanding what his former homeland was being compared to but getting pretty damn tired of being silent all this time. That does explain why there isn't any fell magic coming off of you. So if you don't have proper demons, how come your body has been tainted by an outside source? Roker pondered aloud, wondering if doing so would get him an answer to that question. Naruto started to scratch his head, trying to come up with an answer to that question himself. His grip on his own past was almost non-existent. He remembered how to perform jutsu, as well as some information that might help aid in a Scourge invasion of his former homeland. Everything else was either a blur or it was like looking at a scene being performed in a theater in which the acts didn't make a single noise and you've missed so much of the beginning that you have no idea what is going on. The image of a giant fox-like creature trapped inside of the biggest cage he had ever seen stuck in his mind rather strongly. Especially since it seemed to be held closed, rather comically, by a single tiny piece of paper with the word "seal" written on it. I'm not sure of the details, but I suspect that a giant fox-like creature may have played a part in it. Was all the blonde could answer. With a short, sharp, tisk noise, Roker started to shake his head in a disgusted manner. Well, whatever tried to corrupt you did a piss-poor job of it. It barely did any damage to your soul and the physical corruption was minimal at best. And this is a problem because? The Lich questioned, trying to get to the bloody point for once. Roker sighed at the stupidity surrounding him. If this had been a normal cult member asking him these stupid questions he would have used them in some sort of dark ritual by now. Maybe more if they were female, but he had a feeling that the master would disapprove of him slaying 2 currently valued members of the Scourge out of spite. Getting the king's disapproval was never a good idea if you wanted to continue existing in a way that didn't result in you screaming in agony for the rest of time. This is a problem, Lich, because the runt isn't tainted enough in body or mind to truly use the unholy magic running through him to the best of his abilities. If you want him to be even halfway decent with even the most basic of necromantic spells, you're going to have to change something in him. Until then, I'm not even going to bother wasting my time teaching him crap he wouldn't even begin to understand. Don't contact me again until you have at least got me something to damn well work with. Why do people worship and pray to the light? This might seem like a silly question at first, but when you really start to think about it the subject gets complex rather quickly. For instance, when did worship of the light begin? And for that matter, why did it begin in the first place? History has taught us that if the holy magic started anywhere, it would have been with the night elves over 10,000 years ago. After all, that is when all schools of magic began in some form or another. But there was no god or goddess of the light, no rituals done in order to please it or show that you were worthy of its gifts. It just sort of took the backseat when compared to the other magic-based schools during that period of time. Hell, the moon got worshipped more back then than the light was. So what changed? What happened that caused such a lowly school of magic to gain a cult following and wars fought in its name? One word: fear. Much like how the Order of the Silver Hand was given unlimited support against the orcish hordes, fear drove the early members of mankind to the light in order to find answers to what it couldn't understand and to destroy it in a blaze of holy fire in exchange for living a pure life. For all that repenting, self-torturous guilt and slaughtering heretics and infidels, those who followed the light were off the promise of salvation. But does it really give what it promises? Ghosts are often hunted down and forced away from the world before they can be questioned about the afterlife. The few times they have been questioned offering little, and the holy light forbids the practice of the unholy arts of voodoo and necromancy, the only magical arts that allows contact with those who have successfully passed on to the other side, whatever that may be. Maybe speaking to the dead is only considered taboo because it is the only way to uncover the horrible truth about the light. That there is no salvation, there is no paradise for following the path of the light to its often gruesome and painful end. That all it is a sick joke, Some slick scam designed for no other reason than to control the sheep-like masses. At least with when you serve the Lich King, you know what you are getting into. For starters, you can physically see and touch our God, as well as bear witness to the glories of our eternal rewards for our loyal devotion. I don't know about you, but the peace of mind of knowing that your object of worship and the rewards for your loyalty really exist adds a great deal of creditable as far as faith is concerned. What has the light ever really offered us? A little bit of healing here, a small blessing there. A bonfire every now and then when a heretic is captured and tortured before being burned at the stake. That's about it. And what have we given it in return for the poor excuses that it calls gifts? They want to build a church, so we give them prime land that could be used for farming. They want to give speeches about how everyone is an unworthy maggot and we all have to sit there with our heads bowed in submission and take it. And if they want money, good Lord, do they get it? Quote, collectively, the churches dedicated to the worshipping of the light rake in tens of thousands of gold pieces a year, completely tax-free, and they always need you to give them a little more. Do they use this money to help the poor or help pay for the war effort? Do they feed the damn stuff to the light in order to give it that golden glow on the rare occasions they cast spells? Hell no. Those bastards are using it to make their own lives easier. To make their big, non-flea-ridden beds that little bit more comfortable or to purchase a bigger roast hog for the weekly feast. The cult of the damned might do many things, but I can promise you now that we will never have to resort to hanging people so by their thumbs in order to do something so low as to bleed money out of them. We have higher standards than that. Early recruiting speech given by Cult of the Damned heralds during the second recruitment drive for the Cult of the Damned. Popular opening speech communing known as the "What the hell has the light done for us lately?" speech. Hidden somewhere in the land of rice in an underground chamber. Time was almost up. It was rather annoying how it seemed like only yesterday that he had just taken over his current mortal vassal only to blink and suddenly find himself needing a new host body soon. But Orochimaru forced himself to tolerate such minor hardships for one reason and one reason alone. He was on the verge of successfully completing his body-swapping technique. Every time he performed the jutsu the results were always that little bit better, the body lasting that little bit longer than last time. He was quite confident that Sasuke would be the last body he would need to take in such a fashion before he would finally have a body that would last forever. That he would never have to worry about decaying past his peak ever again. While Sasuke had truly met all expectations and even gone above and beyond what the Snake Sannin had originally planned to teach his future host body, he hadn't been the first choice for his final body. That honor should have gone to his strongest and most dedicated follower, Kimimaro. The plan to use Sasuke as the host body had been a quickly thrown together plan B from the start. The original plan had been to lure Sasuke to his service with the promise of enough power to overpower and slay his older brother in combat, only to betray him and scientifically combine the Kaguya bloodline in his planned host body with the Uchiha bloodline in Sasuke, creating what might have been the strongest bloodline the world had ever seen. But fate cruelly ruined this plan when Kimimaro fell ill. Such is life, he supposed. Thinking of the deceased Kimimaro, the Snake Sannin smiled despite the pain that told him that time was running out for this body. While he had been unable to recover the remains of what had once been his strongest follower due to his final technique more or less entombing him in a razor-sharp forest of bones miles across, for this same reason no one else had been able to get a hold of his body either. Before his mind could continue to wander down this road of thought, the bed-ridden Orochimaru lifted his head in order to make eye contact with his new number 1 agent. "Any news to report on the location of our missing Naruto, Kabuto?" The older than he appeared Sannin asked in a tone that reminded the listener of a viper's hiss. Kabuto respectfully bowed to the one man on the planet that he had any real respect for, placing the one potential clue to the whereabouts of the missing container of the 9-tailed fox on the ground in front of him. "Our agents report that Naruto has been declared dead by Konoha shortly after he went missing when his name was found crossed off of the frog summoning contract. However, no body has been discovered and only recently did one of our teams locate anything like a clue as to the identity of the container's attackers." Orochimaru had been expecting the first part of Kabuto's report, mostly because he had already been given that trickle of information a couple of times already from 3 different people. While Kabuto was a trusted servant, he wasn't going to trust all of his incoming information reports to a single person. Hell, he had people whose only task was to watch the people who reported to him to ensure that they didn't try to cover up anything important. The news about the identity of Naruto's attackers was new though. Kabuto, you have my undivided attention. Enlighten me. Who finally brought an end to the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed fox? Who finally killed Naruto Uzumaki? Kabuto, for his part, looked rather uneasy. He hid it expertly behind a cold but amused mask of indifference that would have fooled a lesser being who had spent the same amount of time with the silver-haired medical ninja as Orochimaru had. I am rather afraid that we have been unable to come up with a match on any database as of yet. In fact, after all the tests at my disposal that I've used so far, I cannot help but admit that all I've found is more questions than answers. Leaning forwards in order to have a look at just what it was that his assistant and student had brought him, Orochimaru's yellow snake-like eyes landed on what the narrow-minded would call a morbid prize. In front of his most valued lackey lay a severed arm that was encased in armor whose design he had never borne witness to before, made out of a metal that was completely alien to him. He couldn't tell how he knew, but there was something dark about this thing. Something tainted by a force that he didn't recognize in the slightest. And his mind was already having fun coming up with places to start his research on it. Still, he might as well find out what his subordinates had discovered so far. Then start at the beginning. Kabuto. Where did we come across this item of interest? The unnaturally pale shinobi questioned. Standing on the stable ground that knowing the answer to the question offered, Kabuto was quick to calm himself internally before answer. One of our undercover teams discovered it buried under the burnt rubble of a farmhouse that was reportedly Uzumaki's last known location. While they were able to slip it past the everyday ambush squads that had also been searching the area without drawing too much attention to them, the root agents that had more or less unofficially locked the area down proved problematic. Only one of our people made it to one of our safe houses alive, where he died shortly afterwards from his injuries. But he was alive long enough to pass the information and the item of interest along. Heeding his warning about Root being after him, the team at the safe house abandoned it as soon as possible, taking everything of value and destroying everything they couldn't take with them. They were the ones who managed to get this to us. Nodding his head in understanding, Orochimaru simply answered, "Good. They have all served me well." Pausing for a few seconds as if in silent debate with himself, the snake-like human being smiled as he ordered, "Kabuto, fetch me my wheelchair." "Sir," was the somewhat surprised answer that Kabuto gave. He knew that his master was currently suffering from the body that was currently playing host to him finally rejecting him, but even then Orochimaru tended to have too much pride to ask for help doing the few things that demanded that he leave the bed. To have him ask for the wheelchair was huge to the silver-haired medic. "You heard me, Kabuto. Fetch me my wheelchair. We will continue this conversation where it should have begun, in my laboratory. You can tell me exactly what you found out so far about our mystery arm on the way." Scholomance, Western Library, Study Area. It had been a grand total of 4 days since the encounter with Roker. Taking the Elder Death Knight's parting words in stride, Amalthazad had informed Naruto that, since they were currently staying at one of the largest and greatest schools in the world that was infamous for hoarding Scourge-related artifacts and housing the largest collections of magical texts dedicated to the black arts, with the majority being in the arts of necromancy and other death magics, this would be the perfect place to perform some research and discover the best possible way to unlock the unholy monster that was locked inside, waiting to break out and maim other people. Thus began Naruto's stay in the library. Not being distracted by the need to eat, sleep or go to the bathroom, the blonde was able to take full advantage of the 24-hour banks of knowledge that were now at his disposal. He would admit that quite a number of theories and ideas were quite difficult to understand at first, since he didn't know the basics that were required in order to understand what he was reading, but help in some shape or size was almost always around. After all, he was not the only person who used the library. Cult of the Damned students, teachers and even the more educated undead beings who were currently staying or teaching at the Scholomance shared the library with each other almost 24 hours a day. In fact, Naruto was pretty sure that even after 4 days there were still beings that had been using the room filled with what many considered forbidden knowledge for longer than he had. The most notable of these people was Sarah. She was a cult member who was on the road to her final exams. Naruto had spoken to her a couple of times, watched her perform a couple of rituals whenever he needed a physical demonstration or sometimes when she was just practicing something on her own. The woman was in her late teens, early 20s with dark ebon hair and the sharpest green eyes that Naruto had ever seen. The purple tattoos and eyeliner that was petty standard for Cult of the Damned members everywhere gave her a truly dark beauty. She was also the main person that he went to whenever he needed something explained or shown to him. He was able to convince her to help him by suggesting that explaining things to him would not only aid her in remembering her stuff by reinforcing what she already knew as well as prepare her for the off chance that she was stuck in a teaching position. The other thing that Naruto had noticed about her was her voice. He wasn't sure what it was about it, but it just seemed to inspire and encourage those around her. He wasn't the only one to notice either, since he had seen no less than 4 groups of 2 males speak to her over the past few days. She didn't speak about what they talked about, but Sarah just smirked with a knowing grin that truly did belong on the face of a prankster of sorts when asked. However, on the 4th day of his stay in the library, Sarah was nowhere to be found, having gone off to perform her final test before being granted the gift of immortality through undeath along with 9 of her other classmates. While he didn't exactly know what the test it was, Amalthazad was helping to oversee it. Of course, Naruto's studies had brought with them memories of what he could only assume were his own school days. It was rather weird, since whenever he had one of these flashbacks he always witnessed it as a third person. The memories about his school years were also different from the ones before given the fact that they contained sounds. It was possible to listen to the conversations he had had with his old teachers. It was not a pleasant experience by any meaning of the word. It had surprised him that out of all his school teachers, only the 2 at the end seemed to not hold some kind of bad blood against him, and by then it was far too late. The damage had been done. The basics he was meant to have learned from the teachers before them were either tainted by the desire to see him dead, never explained clearly to him if he asked them what they meant, or in some cases missing because he had been ordered out of the room for some stupid, overcharged reason. Such a negative learning environment had screwed over his living self big time, no doubt having a major impact on the rest of his life. Still, this didn't stop him from respecting the last 2 teachers for trying their best to undo the damage that their peers had caused. All the memory really did at the end of the day was make him further question why he had died to protect the way of life of people who hated his guts for no reason, to the point that they were willing to sabotage his education in order to get him killed. Reading over what seemed like the 1,000th scroll of unholy rituals that day, in reality it was 12, Naruto was about to put the scroll down and find something else to do when the last ritual caught his attention. He read it, reread it, and continued to reread it a number of times to ensure that he had understood every single detail, that he hadn't missed anything truly important that could bite him in the ass later. In fact, he was so engrossed in what he was reading he didn't notice the familiar figure floating just behind him. "Found something interesting, Naruto?" Amalthazad asked, chuckling slightly in his hollowly, wisp-like voice as the blonde Death Knight jumped a little in surprise. Naruto turned to the Lich that had become a mentor and teacher to him, and despite the small, mock glare he sent the bag of bones way, the blonde-haired former shinobi greatly respected Amalthazad and everything he had done for him so far. While he would admit that for the most part the Lich left him alone to do his own thing, this was because there was very little that he could help him do for the time being. Whenever Naruto had a question or if there was something that he didn't fully understand, Amalthazad was more than willing to dedicate his time to help him understand it. Forgetting the ritual in his hands for a few moments, Naruto quickly asked the first question that came to his mind. "So how did Sarah do on the test?" Blinking in what could have only been surprise for a second, the everlasting smile on Amalthazad seemed to become much more honest. "She passed with flying colors. Out of her group of 10, only her and 1 other passed correctly. In fact, she is the first one in 6 months to have earned the right to lichdom. Ross Frost Whisper and Dark Master Gandaling are currently helping her set up the rituals needed for her ascension as we speak." It was now Naruto's turn to blink in shock. From what he had learned from Amalthazad and the numerous books and scrolls he had read here, someone being raised into undeath as a lich was a rare but worthwhile occasion. "That's great news," Naruto exclaimed gleefully. From what he had seen, Sarah had earned her soon-to-be enacted promotion in the world. So has a Lich name been selected yet, or is everyone waiting for her to become one first? He asked as an afterthought. He remembered reading in one of the texts he had gotten his hands on about Liches and how, when they ascended, they gave up their mortal name and were given a new one from those who performed the ritual. It was very rare for a Lich to keep their own name, with the only known one who had being the major domo Kel'Thuzad himself. He also remembered reading that once the new name was selected, calling a Lich by their old, mortal one was often considered quite a rude insult to them. Amalthazad thought about how to word his answer for a second before going with, "Not just yet, but we can expect Lady Deathwhisper to take it the moment the ritual is finished." "So what did you find that had captured your attention so much that you didn't hear me coming?" Quote, remembering the scroll that he had forgotten about when he heard the good news about Sarah, and quickly handed it over to his mentor, pointing out the last ritual written on it. "Read that one and tell me what you think." Quote, as the Lich began to read what had gotten Naruto's attention, the blonde briefly pondered something that no doubt should have caught his attention days ago. The scrolls, books and texts he had been more or less skim-reading for days on end were all written in words that belonged to languages that he didn't know the names of, let alone had the right to be able to understand without having to learn them. This confused him for a moment or so before he simply accepted that it must have been like the ability to wield any weapon he laid his hands on, like a master who had a lifetime of practice without even having to know what the damn weapon's name was to begin with. Just another benefit of being a Death Knight, he guessed. With the deceptive slowness of lava, a look of understanding crossed Amalthazad's face as he reread the ritual that his current student, future colleague, had taken an interest in. He had to admit that the idea showed great promise and would be more than enough to serve their needs. It would be a simple matter to track down a holy site in order to take full advantage of this. You could barely swing a dead cat around without hitting something other people considered holy. There was only one tiny flaw that wasn't so much a flaw as a need for careful planning. A vital ingredient was missing that needed to be selected carefully. No doubt that it shows promise, but we need to select the right corpse for the task. The Lich explained, looking over the ritual one more time to make damn sure that he hadn't missed anything vital himself. Taking where his student had come from and his abilities had not escaped his notice either. There is also the fact that we have no idea how using this on you will affect you. Charkife we used, say, a warlock's corpse. I had to ask, but do you already have someone in mind, or are we going to have to do a lot of research on the matter? Truthfully, Naruto had two primary candidates in mind already, both of whom would not only give him new abilities to use at his command, but they would also reinforce his Death Knight abilities dramatically. The only real decision that needed to be made at the moment was whose body was he planning to recover first? The loyal friend who he felt had made a powerful impact on his life, or the zealot-like enemy who one couldn't help but admire the dedication of. It was a truly hard call, and Naruto didn't really know which one to go after first. Reaching into a hidden pocket of his armor, Naruto removed a golden coin that had been given to him for reasons that still weren't completely clear to him. While the gold in the coin might have been worth something back in the elemental nations, he had been told that the coins were a type of currency here. He had merely accepted the fact that money was money, and it was generally better to have some than none at all. Looking at both sides of the coin, Naruto saw that one side had a decently imprinted emblem of some kind on it, while the other either had a poorly imprinted human head with a crown, or it was a fairly good picture but a rather ugly cane. If it was the latter, he doubted the artist behind this suddenly found themselves with a bleak and uncomfortable life. Royalty rarely appreciated honesty if it pictured them in a poor light. Flipping the coin, Naruto silently picked which side stood for what in his mind before the golden objective landed in the palm of his hand, ugly king face up. Amalthazad, I want you to get a hold of as many shades as you can find a map of the elemental nations, and Kami, help me, get ready to create a portal. We have some old friends of mine that we need to pick up. A few miles away from the Valley of the End, the edge of the Bone Forest. A truly remarkable yet terrifying landscape. The Bone Forest of Konoha had suddenly appeared 3 years before in what was once long, flowing plains of grasslands that was often used by travelers and traders to cut off a days or so to get between the north of the Land of Fire to pretty much everywhere else in the country, since it allowed them to bypass the forests the Land of Fire was famous for. Only a tiny handful of people knew how the Bone Forest had been created and why. To the countless travelers and traders who had once used the fields for passage, the impassable, razor-sharp bone spikes, spears and pikes that made up the Bone Forest were a sign from Kami himself that the land was cursed. The exact number of people who had attempted to find a way through the death trap and were never seen again would be forever unknown, since no one was willing to go in after their remains. As a result, no one came this way anymore. Civilian, shinobi, birds and animals alike avoided this cursed, unnatural place like the plague on the landscape it was. Standing on the edge of the seemingly endless bone-white, razor-shaped instruments of death while surrounded by undead creatures stood Naruto as he looked on indifferently. Oddly enough, he felt a little at home here. While the memory of this place had been connected to a larger one that was kind of broken up and fuzzy at best, Naruto did know the secret of the Bone Forest. He knew how it was created and what still remained hidden in its depths. Despite the abilities and immortality he had been granted upon being raised from the grave, the reason he wasn't going into the forest itself to locate the remains of its creator was because he liked the feel of his flesh and muscle on his bones. Just because he could survive without them didn't mean that he really wanted to. It was for this reason he had requested the usage of the shades. Ghost-like creatures that while transparent suggested the blackness of the magic that had been used to give them form in undeath. He had selected them for this task because unlike him they didn't have a body that could be torn into tiny little pieces if they entered the bone forest, therefore avoiding the bone-white death that the cursed forest was infamous for. Also, despite the lack of body, shades could interact with the physical world. It was a literal case of, I can touch you, but you can't touch me. The body that you are looking for will be located somewhere near the middle of the forest, either in pieces on the ground or sticking out of one of the larger bones. Because it has been exposed to nature for a couple of years, I fully expect it to be completely bone dry. When you locate the remains, I want you to take the utmost care in bringing them back to us. Is that understood? Naruto ordered, looking from one shade to the next expectantly. It was a rather strange situation when a shade started to speak to you. They didn't exactly use words. Instead, you sort of got the answer implanted directly into your head without having to go through your ears. It wasn't painful or anything, at least not to him, but it was rather annoying. Thankfully the message this time was a short, yes sir, before the dozen or so creatures of shadow phased through the bones that would have sliced a human being who tried to do something like that in two. It was now only a matter of time until they found what he was looking for. While he may not have remembered the name of the person they were said to collect, you don't just forgot someone who can use their own spine as a kick-ass sword. Taking a seat and turning to Amalthazad, Naruto decided that now would be as good a time as any to get a question out of the way that had been bugging him for a little while now. He had asked it once before, but the Lich had simply answered that the walls have ears and that he wouldn't attempt to make things easier for those who didn't deserve such treatment. Since they were out in the middle of nowhere and they had time to kill, he might as well ask again. So what exactly is the final exam for Cult of the Damned members? The blonde asked, capturing Amalthazad's attention once more. Despite the fact that they were in the middle of nowhere, the Lich looked around anyway as if out of an old habit before answering. When students come to the Scholomance to study, they are grouped together in classes of 10. For the entire length of their studies, their group will only have those 10 people in it. If someone flees the school for some reason or more likely, dies, their spot isn't filled by anyone else. 3 days before their final exam, the remaining members of a class are brought together and told just what the final exam is. Unless there is only one left alive in the class to begin with, one of their number has to undergo a ritual that will kill them and raise them as a shade. Everyone left standing after the ritual receives a blessing from the powers that be, but the fewer that are left means that the blessings for those that remain are stronger. With his explanation finished, the Lich watched as Naruto tried to work out what the true meaning of the test was. Taking his time to think over just what the intention of the test was, Naruto did one of the few stills of he had had when he was alive that had gotten much better in undeath, looking underneath the underneath. In a way it was sort of like a twisted version of a teamwork test. At first glance it seemed like the whole point of the school system was to, other than teaching the students dark magic, get them to know each other, befriend each other, then have them all kill each other and see who can twist the knife when push comes to shove. But there was more to it than that. The first death, the needed death, seemed more like a sacrifice for the greater good than anything else. One death so the rest of the team could advance. It was the complete and utter opposite of what the first glance told you. But didn't the one who underwent the ritual get turned into a shade? Looking at the Lich, Naruto politely asked, what happens to the cult members who die but didn't undergo the self-sacrificing ritual? While he didn't need to answer, Amalthazad did so anyway since his student was on the right trail of thinking. They either get raised as cannon fodder or have their bits and pieces used for any projects or rituals that need them. Slowly beginning to connect the dots, Naruto quickly figured out the true meaning of the ritual. It wasn't really intended to for the purpose of sacrificing one for the good of the many, although it could be interrupted that way. It was really giving those few cult members who knew that their skills wouldn't get them too far against their peers in the second part of the exam the chance to gain the reward of immortality without the risk of being turned into cannon fodder or spare parts. After all, despite the somewhat weird method of communication, shades were rather useful creatures. As spies or recon units, almost no creatures living, dead or somewhere in between could match the pure talents of the ghost-like shade. Unless you had set up your defenses with the intention of dealing with shades and the other ghostly creatures the Scourge, and to a somewhat lesser extent, the Forsaken, had to offer, then you wouldn't even know they were there until they had seized you by the throat. Becoming such a creature was a wonderful thing when compared to being raised as a mindless zombie, whose sole purpose is to be a meat shield or test dummy for the higher-ranked undead, i.e. everyone. So that could only mean that the purpose of the second part of the test was to see who were the strongest, fastest and smartest of the potential candidates by having them weed out the lesser ones. His answer selected, Naruto simply answered, "So the point of the exam is a survival of the fittest kind of thing?" Amalthazad shook his head at the answer, confusing Naruto a little before the Lich began to explain, "You are not that far away from the truth. While the second part of the exam is a no-holds-barred survival of the fittest battle between the members of a class with the rewards of graduating depending on being one of those left standing at the end, exactly what the reward is depends strongly on how you came about being one of those still standing." When Naruto tilted his head a little more in confusion, the Lich sighed slightly as he tried to come up with the best possible way to explain the situation. Let us use the future Lady Deathwhisper's exam from today as an example. 3 days ago, when the terms of the exam were given, we had those who were going to undergo it watched at all times by shades and a couple of other means in order to discover what the students were plotting and scheming in order to ensure that they would be among those who were still breathing long enough to earn their just reward. Only 2 members of the class didn't fall into some sort of faction. One of them was Sarah, while the other one accepted publicly from the start that he would be the one who underwent the ritual because there was no way in hell that he would last long against his peers. It sounds like whoever the shade guy was suffered from a rather severe no-confidence problem. Naruto stated bluntly, finding the idea of taking the easy way out to be distasteful. To be honest, it was the best move John could have made. The Lich responded, not liking getting off track but feeling the need to explain things anyway. John wasn't a bad student. He was slightly above average in his studies and got along fine with his teachers. However, everyone else in his class was recognized as prodigies of the dark arts of magic. Even if he had sided with one of the factions and somehow survived the battle to the death between the factions, his allies would most likely have just killed him anyway so that they didn't have to share power with the weakling. It is seen as a sign of wisdom to understand when it is time to accept what you are assured to get rather than risk your future on what you know is out of your reach. Over the course of the 3 days, as I know you noticed, each faction at one point or another approached Sarah with the offer to have her join them so they could overcome the others. Instead of saying yes to just one of them, she agreed to side with all of them on the condition that they keep their alliance a secret until the exam itself was underway. So when the exam began and all the factions turned on each other, Sarah was out of the crossfire because everyone else believed that she was on their side. So she had all the time in the world to prepare her chosen spell and killed the lot of them in a single bloody stroke. With her talents with convince others to do what she wished, her power in magic and even her teaching ability when working with you proved that she was a worth candidate for lichdom. Naruto was rather shocked by the turn of events that helped his friend reach one of the heights of power that all members of the cult crave. He asked himself why Sarah would turn on all of her potential allies, and the answer hit him like a pink-hair bipolar banshee who was as flat as a cat run over by a wagon. They were all going to betray her when they didn't need her anymore, weren't they? He asked aloud, frowning when he saw Amalthazad nod his head. The very second that all the other factions were dealt with, they were all planning on dealing with Sarah as well. She merely didn't give them the chance to do so. Nodding his head silently in agreement, Naruto looked back at the bone forest and wondered just how much longer the shades were going to take. Deciding that the conversation needed to continue after a few moments, Naruto couldn't help but ask, So how did you become a lich then? Amalthazad glanced at Naruto for a moment and truly did ponder if he should tell him the whole story or just enough to keep him happy. After a few moments of internal debate, he decided to keep his secrets to himself. Almost exactly the same as Sarah did, barring one or two trivial details that were slightly different. Before he could question just what those trivial details were, Naruto's thoughts were interrupted by what only could be described as the experience of triumph without it necessarily being your own. Turning towards the bone forest, Naruto's gaze was lured upwards by the gathering of shadow-like shades coming towards his and Amalthazad's location, carrying something along with them. As the wraith-like creatures put down their bounty, Naruto couldn't help but frown at the state of the bone wielder's earthly remains. While he wasn't surprised that the only thing that was left of him were bones, giving one of them a slight squeeze, he was surprised at the fact that it was still stronger than any metal he could care to name, but the amount of bones left were worrying. All that they had managed to locate was the spine, ribcage and the left and right shoulders and the right arm. There was nothing else. Is this all? Images of finding the bones from the waist up hanging out of one of the bigger, sharper bones flashed through Naruto's mind. They had been able to remove what was sticking out, but everything below the waist was gone. The left arm had been little more than a giant spear made of bone, and the moment that they got the body free it disconnected at the shoulder, plummeting to the ground and embedding itself so deep into the earth and rock that they couldn't pull the damn thing out again. The skull had simply not been there when they arrived. They had looked all around for the damn thing, but wherever it was now they had no clue, and that they were really sorry if he was upset with them and to please not hurt them too much. Amalthazad didn't like where this was going. Most Death Knights he knew or had known at one time or another had been real hard asses when it came to their subordinates following their orders to the letter. He knew for a fact that if it had been Bloodbane standing with him right now, this group of shades would be banished from the world of the living so fast that when they turned up wherever they go when ghosts die they wouldn't have known what the hell happened to them. For a few seconds, the world held its breath as the threat of a high-ranking servant of the Scourge losing their cool and unleashing their fury became almost a certainty. So it was with much surprise and shock that Naruto simply bowed his head and said, "Thank you for doing this for me. You've done a good job." The shock was like a bolt of lightning, slowing the world around it to a standstill while filling it with shock and surprise. Even when the moment passed for the rest of the world, those surrounding Naruto continued to stare at him as if he had just suggested that the Lich King went to bed in a pink nightie 2 sizes too small with a stuffed toy rabbit named Mr. Fufflikins. The shock was so thick that you could have cut it into slabs and used it as a cheap building material. Things continued like this until Naruto started to feel a little awkward and started to rub the back of his neck before he just had to ask, "Why are you all staring at me like that?" It was the shades who answered first, the exact way they expressed their concerns difficult to understand with images and sensations but ultimately being summed up into 2 different but related sentences. "Why aren't you punishing us?" And, "You said thank you. No one ever says thank you to us." While he gave it a hell of an effort, a lot of the messages got jumbled in Naruto's head and simply didn't make a lick of sense to the blonde. Amalthazad understood it perfectly, however, and decided to translate it into words his student could understand. "They are wondering why you haven't lost your temper at them for failing to bring back all of the body and are completely in shock because you said thank you to them. Why should I be mad at them? It wasn't their fault that the body was in the condition it was in when we arrived, and they did their best to bring us as much of it as they could. Sure, we might have been able to do something with the spear arm or whatever it was, but if things work out like they are meant to, it won't really matter in the slightest if we have it or not." Naruto explained, calming the shades down a little but still a little worried about the situation. "Besides, they did a good job and they deserve my thanks for that. I couldn't have done it without them." Amalthazad had started out as a member of the Cult of the Damned and after that had the pleasure and honor of joining the Scourge as a Lich. He had seen and done things that would either sicken or driven lesser mortals insane just by witnessing with an iron stomach and for the confirmed promise of immortality. But what he was seeing before him with his very eyes, feeling with his very mind, was by all rights impossible. The shades, in their own telepathic way, were expressing respect. Respect was something that was often hard-earned in the Scourge and was only really valued if it was one of the members of the inner circle that was giving it. It was for this reason alone that almost all members of the Scourge and the Cult of the Damned tended to kiss up to their superiors. When it came to dealing with the lower ranks of the undead, things tended to get a lot uglier. When it came to dealing with the lower orders, niceties and politeness were almost always certain to be among some of the first casualties, followed shortly by mutual respect. Death Knights of any rank, when dealing with lower-ranked undead, often bypassed the often long and tedious road to mutual respect and simply used fear to install a sense of loyalty into their underlings. Nothing ensured loyalty faster than the very real threat of an enraged Death Knight if you messed up. While it was a truly rare event for a Death Knight to inspire any sort of legitimate respect without the use of creative, deadly and often painful brute force, the fact that Naruto was respected the Shades in turn made a Malthazad open his mouth so wide in surprise and shock that his jaw hit the ground. He didn't know what was going on inside Naruto's head, but it felt like some universal law of the Scourge that no one had ever written down or explained to anyone else had just been broken. He was half expecting the Lich King himself to pop out from behind a tree and slaughter everyone there just to prove a point. While the Lich was glancing around at the different trees with a great deal of caution, he didn't notice Naruto glancing at him, then at the ground, then over to one of the Shades with a questioning look in his eye. The Shade in question nodded before drifting over to the piece of ground that Naruto had looked at, recovering the bottom half of a Malthazad's jaw and offering it to the Lich in question silently. Giving a small chuckle at the situation, Naruto grinned widely as he announced, "Malthazad, while I get our cargo ready for transport, I want you to put your damn jaw back in and get a portal ready to take us to our second destination." Muttering under his breath as he walked over to the pile of bones that he needed to get ready to transport, Naruto almost sadly said to himself, "It's time for me to meet up with an old friend." The Land of Waves, the graves of Zabuza Momochi and Haku, last name unknown. 3 years. It had been over 3 years since Naruto had stood in this spot in front of the grave of his first true friend. He had promised that he would come back and visit, but things had just gotten so damn busy. Just standing here in silence brought back more memories than Naruto cared to remember about his first week or so away from the academy. While he remembered the early days of Team 7 quite well, all Naruto could do was frown as the past danced its terrible dance before his eyes. While they were slightly more pleasant than his school days, what positive things could anyone claim happened in these early days of his training? His teammates were some emotional brat that seemed to hate or detest everything around him, the bloody flat-chested living banshee with pink hair, and they were all stuck with a teacher who was too damn busy reading pornography or walking the path to life to teach them anything. He didn't know what bullshit this was, but it sure as hell wasn't training him to be prepared to take a life without hasting. This wasn't getting him prepared for life as a government-paid mercenary whose very life and profession relied on being able to commit murder just because someone is paying you to do so. They should have been spending every waking hour around the clock perfecting their fighting styles or learning how to best use their abilities instead of hunting down a stupid fucking cat that kept running away from its owner. And what made it all worse was that the one-eyed, constantly late pornographic reading fucktard knew that their combat styles were flawed. He knew their weaknesses and strengths. Hell, he had even gone as far as to tell them just what they should be doing to best work together as a team. And then he did nothing about it, absolutely nothing at all. The prick never even mentioned it again after that first stupid bell test was over and done with. If this was the standard education of shinobi, Naruto honestly had to ask himself how the hell he had lived as long as he did. When the Scourge raised even the most simplistic of mindless undead zombies, they were at least kind enough to give the zombies basic combat training. Teeth go bite. Claws go slash. It wasn't much, but it still gave them a better chance of survival than he had back then. Sweet Lich King in Ice Crown, by all rights he should have been the one buried here, not Haku. Sorry to interrupt, whatever it is you are doing, but would you care to start before someone comes along? Amalthazad's voice requested, interrupting Naruto's flashbacks and returning him to the here and now. While the tombstones themselves looked well maintained and looked after, he suspected that not many people came up here. The evidence presented by the weeds growing around the tombstones suggested that those that did come up here didn't do so often. They wouldn't be coming here today at any rate. It was raining like it was going out of season, and they needed to clear out the current supply of cats and dogs before they could get new ones. It wasn't that windy though, and after his stay in the frozen death that was Ice Crown itself, some heavy rain was nothing to the blonde. After waiting for what he considered to be a respectful amount of time, Naruto stuck his shovel into the dirt that covered Haku's remains. When he had set the shades to ensure that they got a clear warning if anyone was coming here, One of them had returned with a shovel it had borrowed from one of the local farmers before returning to its duty. While Amalthazad had disapproved of the disobeying of orders, Naruto was actually quite happy to have the farming tool to help him with his task. If he had wanted to, he could have created clones to speed things up. He didn't. Digging up Haku alone felt right to him. While it was generally discouraged in the Scourge to show restraint when it came to digging up dead bodies, Naruto's whole life had been heavily impacted by what he could honestly call the first true friend he had ever had. Sure, he might have had other friendships after Haku that could have been greater or at least lasted longer, not that hard. All things considered, the ice-using shinobi was the first. Besides, if anyone asked him later, he could always say that he didn't want to cause any more damage to corpse than had already been done. For a long time the only sounds in the little makeshift graveyard were Naruto's shovel hitting and removing dirt and the noise of the mist that kept Amalthazad floating moving about. Neither of them said anything to the other. While the whole, holy, unholy, thing was a gray area for the Scourge, that was a darker gray but a gray nonetheless, Amalthazad recognized that the act of digging up this body was very important to the blonde and thus kept his mouth shut while looking around at the dreary he was currently in. From time to time his eyes were drawn to the large and important-looking sword that was sticking out of the grave next to the one they were digging up. While he understood the tradition of burying legendary weapons with their wielders, the Lich couldn't help but find it amusing that if this grave was located across the sea somewhere on a different landmass, regardless of what defenses or where it was hidden, someone who had nicked the sword in the 3 years since the wielder was buried. When Naruto struck the remains of Haku, there was no excited cheer or heartfelt sob. He was completely neutral as he brought the few non-damaged bones and rotten organs he needed from the body with a great deal of care not to touch or disturb anything any more than he needed to. Placing the remains of Haku in a sack that was slightly darker than the one they had kept the bone user's remaining bones in, Naruto began to fill the grave back in with care and silence. It was only when Naruto was patting the dirt down with the shovel to level it out that he said anything at all. "Summon the shades and get the portal ready. We've gotten everything we came here." Before he finished his sentence, Naruto's eyes landed on the Kabikirabocho, Zabuza's decapitating carving knife. After a few seconds of what could only have been some sort of internal debate, the blonde Death Knight reached out and took the sword's handle, lifting it out of the grave with unholy ease. Giving the blade a few test swings, Naruto nodded to himself as a smile came to his face before looking back at his mentor. "We've got all that we came here for. Summon the shades and let's get out of here. Do you have a location to perform the ritual in mind?" he asked, looking right at the Lich as the bone-constructed spellcaster smiled the everlasting grin of his kind. "I already have a place in mind. And since it is located in the Plaguelands, we don't even need to take a portal out of the Scholomance." That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.